20% of curriculum time should be wrenched from the overprescribed curriculum that we've got to create a space that belongs to the kids for them to follow their interests, concerns, passions, questions, however you want to phrase it. It should be very much in the hands of the kids.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello once again, my fathomless friends. My name is James Mannion, and it gives me inordinate delight to welcome you to another episode of the Rethinking Education podcast, education's critical friend. In this episode, I bring you an astonishing conversation with an astonishing human being, Derry Hannam, a brilliant thinker and writer and practitioner of democratic education, and the author of the brilliant book, Another Way is Possible, Becoming a Democratic Teacher in a State School. If you haven't come across Derry before, here's the blurb from the back of that book. It says, in his 20 years as a teacher in English state secondary schools, Derry always tried to create environments where students could make choices about and take control of their own learning in a democratic and rights-respecting context. Derry has been described as a bridge person who tries to bring about dialogue between the mainly private democratic education movement with its 500 plus schools worldwide and the state and public school systems. This has at times involved supporting democratic schools in legal actions, a role that he has played in Germany, Denmark, England, and the Netherlands. He's currently supporting startup democratic schools in several countries, advising them how to best work with their respective state systems. If you haven't come across Derry before, or indeed if you are already aware of and are a fan of his work, strap yourself in because you're in for a treat. We recorded this conversation in two parts. In the first part, we look at Derry's own experience of education and the journey that led him to becoming a democratic teacher in a state school. And in the second part of our conversation, we get into the practicalities of what democratic education looks like, and especially in the context of state schools. If you would rather dive in straight to that democratic education stuff, I recommend that you fast forward to around about the 1 hour 20 mark, depending on how long this rambling introduction lasts for. Before we get into it, it is incumbent upon me to inform you of 3 events that are coming up which you may be interested in. Firstly, the Rethinking Education Conference is back. It is taking place later this year on Saturday, the 23rd of September, that's 2023 for you future podcasts, at Parliament Hill School in North London. Last year's conference was an incredibly beautiful, life-affirming affair, and this year's conference is shaping up to be every bit as amazing. The Rethinking Education community is a broad tent. Mainstream educators, alternative educators, children and young people, parents and carers, homeschoolers, unschoolers, education psychologists, researchers, you name it. All are welcome, and as far as possible, all are equally represented on the platforms at the conference, which makes this a conference like no other. We're offering a special discount for friends of the podcast. If you enter the promo code RE20FRIEND, all capital letters, you will receive a 20% discount. That's RE20FRIEND, all caps. Secondly, I am co-hosting a one-day conference in London in June called Metacognition in Action. It's on Friday, the 23rd of June in central London, and it's mainly aimed at school leaders and leaders of teaching and learning in schools, but it's really open to anyone with an interest in metacognition, and I know that other people are interested. I recently wrote a blog called Metacognition Will Set You Free, which sets out the rationale for this conference, or at least for my part in it. As I say, I'm co-hosting this conference with the brilliant Roger Sutcliffe, the author of a fantastic book called Thinking Moves A to Z, Metacognition Made Simple. Again, we're running a promo code for friends of the podcast. Enter the code REMET, that's REMET20, REMET20 to receive a 20% discount. Again, that's all capital letters. Places are limited, so get in there soon if you fancy that. And the third thing is that I'm running a free 1-hour webinar on implementation science called Making Change Stick, a practical guide to implementing school improvement, which is also the title of a book that I'm writing currently. This will be on Wednesday, the 14th of June, 2023, from 4 to 5 p.m. UK time. If you are interested in bringing about lasting positive change in your school or workplace, or indeed in your own life, and why wouldn't you be, this webinar will be right up your alley. It'll be a very interactive affair, and it'll be an opportunity for you and for the other participants to interrogate the implementation science toolkit that I've been assembling over the last 5 years or so. There are links to all of these events in the show notes. Finally, before we get into today's episode, I would like to say a huge thank you to you, my dear listeners and viewers. This week, it came to my attention that the Rethinking Education podcast, quite remarkably, is in the top 3% of listened to podcasts globally. That sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I think it's mainly a reflection of all the zillions of podcasts that fizzle out after an episode or two, or the people who don't promote them at all. Those pod hosts should come to my implementation science webinar. Anyway, thank you, really from a heartfelt place. Without you, this thing would not make any sense at all. If you would like to support the podcast in some way, you can do so if you wish via patreon.com/repod or via buymeacoffee.com/repod. There are links in the show notes. Any support is gratefully received, but please don't feel obliged. Simply lending me your ears and your precious time is the greatest gift of all. That sounds ridiculously nauseating, doesn't it? But it's also true. Right. Without further ado, I will now hand over to my recent fascinating conversation with Derry Hannam. I hope you enjoy the show. Derry Hannam, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Hello, James. Nice to be here.
I have really been looking forward to this conversation. I have absolutely thoroughly enjoyed reading your brilliant book over the last few weeks. Another Way is Possible, Becoming a Democratic Teacher in a State School. Congratulations on it. I think it's a wonderful thing. And it's a really unusual book because people often write books that are happening about things that are currently happening right now or that have recently happened. But you're writing about something that happened in, is it 1970 to 72 or 69 to 71?
That's it.
Yeah, so something around that period of time. So 50 plus years ago, in the first 2 years of your teaching career, which is absolutely fascinating. And I really want to talk to you in detail about this. But I think that what makes sense, firstly, is to talk to you about to find out more about you as a person and your own experience of school and the journey that you went on in order to become that democratic teacher in the early 70s. Does that sound like a plan to you?
That's fine with me, James, as long as my voice holds out.
Marvelous. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of your own experience of school. What was your own experience of school?
Boredom, basically. Boredom and being put into a class separated from my friends. I think I must have shown a little spark of 11 plus potential. So I was taken away from all my friends who lived in the same street that I lived in, who were all in the bottom stream. And I got put in the top stream. After a while, it seemed to me that most of the other people who were in the top stream lived in detached houses and had tellies and cars. So what stream you were in seemed to depend on how much money your dad had, but it didn't work in my case. I mean, basically, two ideas developed in my mind over time. One is that the potential of kids for learning is absolutely colossal. If you take some notice of their interests, if you just shove stuff at them, create high levels of anxiety around testing, that's not the best way to do it. And I think I realized as a kid, well, the first thing I saw, James, was streaming going on. And I realized, as I said in the book, that on the whole, the streaming in my primary school, there was 3 streams, and they pretty much followed the tripartite system of the 44 Act. The top stream would be thought of as passing the scholarship, the 11 plus, and getting either to grammar school, or a very tiny handful would get scholarships to elite public schools. The 2 that my primary school sent the odd kid to were Eltham College and Dulwich College, both pretty expensive places. But it dawned on me that the kids in the top stream who would pass the scholarship all tended to live, except for me, actually, and 1 or 2 others, in big houses, in the detached houses in the catchment area of the school. Their parents tended to have cars and televisions, which mine certainly didn't. And then in the middle stream, these were destined for the technical school, and they, on the whole, came from slightly poorer backgrounds. And then the bottom stream, as it was called, would be destined for the secondary modern school. And they tended to live in the council houses, the municipal accommodation in the catchment area. So at quite a young age, I remember about 8, it dawned on me that what kind of school you would end up in depended on what kind of house your parents lived in. I suppose that was a little bit of early sociology or early politics. And I found myself not with most of my friends by being put in the top stream.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. And so what happened next for you? So was this at a time when the 11 plus was happening?
Absolutely. And of course, as you'll know, the grammar schools were already built on the whole, and they were expanded after the 44 Act. The secondary modern schools were created as very poor imitations with, on the whole, poor quality buildings, less well qualified teachers, etc., etc. The technical schools, on the whole, didn't get built. They didn't happen. So in my school, the top stream pretty well all went to the grammar school, and the next 2 streams pretty well all went to the secondary modern school. The 11 plus, I mean, I don't remember being scared stiff by it, but we practiced and practiced and practiced these verbal reasoning kind of questions and little diagrams.
Really?
And I suppose we got quite good at it. We did very little else in the last term, or even the last 2 terms at primary school, than practice for the 11 plus, because the status of the teacher who taught this class, she was known amongst the local parents. Oh, if you can get your kid into Miss Gunn's class, you'll almost certainly pass the 11 plus and go to grammar school.
She crams for it.
That's all we did, except for Friday afternoons when we were allowed to read books that we found interesting. I mentioned this in the book, because there were very few books in the class library that I found interesting. But I was fascinated by the Royal Navy. It was not long after the Second World War, and I knew all about ships and ships' armament and guns and torpedo tubes and all the rest of it, and the major sea battles of the Second World War. So I asked the teacher if I could bring in books from the library about the Royal Navy, and she said, that's okay. And then we managed to get the half an hour read what you liked on Friday afternoon extended to an hour. I did that by persuading some of the girls who were the teacher's favourites to nag the teacher. I didn't do it directly. I tried to work through these favourite girls, and it worked. We got an hour on Friday afternoons.
I love it.
We could read anything we liked except comics, James. Anyway, she encouraged us to read stories, but I borrowed this enormous book called Jane's Fighting Ships. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's a very large book with pictures of every destroyer and cruiser and battleship in all the world's navies. I used to cart this thing in on Friday afternoons and learn about all the armaments of Russian and American battleships. It was wonderful. But I learned all this stuff, and amazingly, I can still remember that HMS Belfast had 9 6-inch guns in 3 turrets of 3, an anti-aircraft armament of, I think they were 20 millimeter or 40 millimeter pom-poms in groups of 8 guns, and secondary armament of 6 4-inch guns for close range work. I knew all this. I can still remember it.
Without wanting to give away your age, this is some several decades ago.
Yeah, it's a lot of decades ago. Senility is setting in. I can't remember the postman's name because he's just changed and introduced himself. But I remember the anti-aircraft armament of Second World War cruisers.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And so your career as a subversive education reformer started at a ripe young age, it sounds like, with this clever ploy to get the teacher's favourite students to campaign for more reading time on a Friday.
It was the only memory I have of the students being allowed to do anything where they took some initiative, anything that they wanted to do. And when I look at the grammar school, I can't think of anything in the 5 years of grammar school where the kids' interests remotely were consulted. They just weren't. You just went in and you went to this lesson and this lesson and this lesson. I had a hilarious experience. My dad was a bus driver. He'd had a little bus company in Dublin that had failed, and he'd come to England and got a job on London Transport. He used to drive our school bus, number 47. And when I did the 11 plus, I must have done quite well in the test because my father was sent a letter which said your son could be interviewed for a place at Dulwich College. My God, Nigel Farage's school.
Yeah.
There's a thought. And the first question on the form was father's occupation. And my father said that he wrote, none of your fecking business. That's what he told me later. Strangely, I didn't get the place.
Yeah, but that's the world that we were living in at that time, right? That it was so blatant. Like, what does your father do? Is like you say, that's the sorting mechanism for this. Well, what is often referred to as a tripartite system, but actually it became like a bipartite system, didn't it?
Well, and then of course the streaming went on. When you got to grammar school, half the 4 streams, there was a Latin stream, a German stream, and then there were 2 woodwork streams, basically, for the not so bright kids. So it even went on. When you got to the blooming grammar school, you were in the 10% or 15% that got there. Yeah. You were streamed again. And I remember my dad said, oh, you must go in the Latin class because you might want to be a priest or a doctor. Not much chance of that. But I was interviewed by the head teacher. And guess what, James? The first question, what does your father do?
Yeah. It's interesting. I interviewed a guy recently called Chris Bagley. I don't know if you've come across him.
Yeah, I know Chris, yeah.
Right. Really interesting guy. And he was he's writing a book at the moment called Shadow Cultures and the Tyranny of School and State, I think it's called. And he talks about these big sort of ideas that we sort of still labor under. And one of them is the order of 3, this idea that goes back to ancient Greece and even further back into history, this idea that there are sort of 3 tiers of people. There are those who are close to God. There's the sort of the the middle class, if you like, and then there's the peasant class, what have you. And that idea has just replicated itself again and again and again through history. And like you say, you could see it in the blueprint for the tripartite system. The comprehensive system was obviously intended to overcome that, but it just replicated itself as ability grouping within comprehensive schools. You hear like primary school teachers all the time say things like, "Oh, my highers, my middles, and my lowers." It's just something that's very sort of deeply ingrained in us. I think that we sort of tend to think of people in this way.
It's so appalling, isn't it? A woman who I used to teach in the school where I was vice principal is now a grandmother, and her grandson at nursery school is very upset because they have three tables. They have the fast table, the average table, and the slow falling behind table. Would you believe this? This is with 4-year-olds, for God's sake. And the boy is very upset because he's come home. He's extremely technically interesting kid, but he's come home because he's been put on the behind table. And that's been done to a 4-year-old. What effect on earth do they think this kind of stuff is going to have on kids? Because if you're told at 4 you're behind, you believe you're a behind person, don't you?
Yeah.
And that sticks with you. It's just
does.
awful. And the incredible thing about this kid, with his granddad, he builds windmills. He's very interested in sustainability. And he's built windmills and found the windiest place in his garden. And they fix these windmills up to little generators for recharging phone batteries. And at the same time, he's being told that he's behind.
Yeah, it's absolutely outrageous. I agree. I read a good paper on this a few years ago. I think it was by Joe Bowler, called The Psychological Prisons from Which They Don't Escape. And that's what those ability groups do. And even if you don't call it the behind table, if you call it the red table or the green table or dragons.
Oh, the kids know.
The kids, of course, they know what it means. But it flies in the face of what we know about child development, which is that it's not linear, like that kids develop at different rates at different times. That sometimes you go backwards in your understanding, sometimes you regress. Like progress is not some linear thing, and that whole idea of speed as well, that it's that the slowness is somehow bad, and being able to do your sums really quickly is somehow better than being able to really take your time and think analytically about maths, for example.
I love Joe Bowler's work. She was at Sussex. I think she's at Stanford now, isn't she? And she's had some problems in the States where traditional maths teachers have been saying rude things about her. But it was interesting when I was working for Ofsted, James, I went to a school in Oxfordshire, where the head of maths had been very interested in Joe Bowler's work. And what she'd done, she'd created a system where the streaming was negotiated with the kids. So the kids could say, well, yes, okay, I find it a bit of a struggle, put me in the slow stream. And it wasn't about high or low, it was about slow or fast. Mm-hmm. And the kids could negotiate changing in stream. And what I found so interesting was in many schools, in theory, where they have streaming, there should be movement between the streams as kids develop at different speeds. But on the whole, it doesn't happen. If you put a kid in a particular stream, they tend to stay there. They make friends there. They think of themselves as someone who is such and such a stream in this subject, and they stay there. But in this school, there was lots of movement between different streams that kids could decide, well, I've caught up pretty well. I think I can go in a slightly faster stream next term. And there was a lot of movement. And I was the curriculum inspector on the team. I had a big argument with the maths inspector who said, "This is crazy. You can't let kids decide what streams they should go into." And so what we did, we analysed the maths results for this school at GCSE and compared it with the average for schools in similar socioeconomic areas. And the results at GCSE were much higher than you would have expected. And it was just another small example. If you listen to the kids, you get better learning.
Yeah, right. And so I think it's fair to. Are you happy to be characterized as a sort of like a radical thinker on education, a radical practitioner of education? That you like, because what's really interesting about your story and the brilliant book that you wrote, Another Way is Possible, becoming a democratic teacher in a state school, is that you didn't really become a democratic teacher in a state school. You sort of you arrived, like, having previously sort of done lots of reading around alternative methods of education. You arrived as a trainee teacher with this sort of intention to do things differently. And I'm interested in the roots of that sort of radicalism, if you like. You talked about your sort of dissatisfaction with this cramming in primary school and the lack of student choice, or like listening to students at your grammar school. Like, what was the journey for you from to going from what sounds like a fairly dissatisfying experience of school to becoming this, like, you know, a newly qualified teacher with an intention to do things in a very different way?
Well, yeah. I mean, my dad encouraged me to do Latin and then to do Greek at grammar school, so in case I wanted to become a priest. But as soon as I was 16, he wanted me out of school and into a job and earning some money. And that the school more or less agreed with him that it would be a good idea if Derry left school as soon as possible. So I wasn't offered a place in the sixth form. And I moved from job to job, gradually developing ideas. One of my jobs for the London County Council allowed me to read a lot of books in what was called the Teachers and Members Library. Not many people used it, and I didn't have much work to do as a trainee. So I used to read philosophy books there. And it seemed to me that if you gave people space to learn, they would. I didn't get much about radical schooling until I actually got to the college, but I did discover a book by this guy, A.S. Neal, and that did seem to me an extremely interesting way to treat kids. And a friend of mine's dad, who taught me jazz piano, was a trade union official. And he told me about a lovely place he used to go to when he was a kid growing up in Camberwell, pretty poor and dangerous part of South London. He went to a club called Clubland, which was run by a Methodist minister called James Butterworth. And you never hear about him in the radical education literature, but he ran this club as a self-governing community. And every member of the club was a member of the club parliament. And they used to make decisions in the Methodist church that the club was attached to. But interestingly enough, who's that famous actor plays a Michael Caine? Michael Caine said this saved him from a criminal career. Michael Caine was a member of Butterworth's Clubland in Camberwell, and it was absolutely, the decisions were made by the young people themselves. They were all members of the club parliament. And I thought that sounded interesting. And then I discovered A.S. Neal and that he ran Summerhill School in a similar way. And then I got a job in a therapeutic community in a big psychiatric hospital near Oxford. It was a therapeutic community. It was a unit in the hospital run by one of the consultants. And the treatment was basically learning to live with each other. And there were 2 meetings every day where decisions were made about how to manage the unit. And it sounded just like a sort of clubland for lunatics, and a sort of Summerhill school in the psychiatric service. Well, I mean, a lot of people think that Summerhill is a crazy place. It absolutely isn't. And this democratic therapeutic community wasn't a crazy place either. What it would try to do was help young people develop understanding of their difficulties rather than give them electric shocks or loads of drugs. And certainly there was absolutely no brain surgery going on, which was still practiced in many psychiatric hospitals at the time. It was a kind of democratic community for people who would learn to solve their life problems by learning to live together, respect each other, etc., etc. So that was my background before going to Teachers College. But when I got there, I was subjected to psychology lectures from a behaviorist enthusiast. He absolutely believed in Pavlov and Skinner. And we had to learn all this stuff about salivating dogs and rats pushing levers to get food pellets, as if this had something to do with children. And I remember saying to this guy, look, mate, I was a mature student. I was a little bit older. I was able to call him mate. And I said, look, mate, I've come here to learn to teach kids. I don't want to teach rats or dogs. Would it be possible to do something else? And I'd read a lot of psychology books when I was working on the therapeutic community. And so we did a deal, basically. I'd stop asking him difficult questions and go to the library. And that's where I found this dusty shelf of books, not just A.S. Neil, but John Dewey, Homer Lane, Tolstoy, Bertrand Russell. All these people had started schools that worked democratically. And I thought, this is it. There's a whole literature here which shows that this stuff really works. So when I had the opportunity to go for teaching practices, I tried it out. And you may remember in the book, I did 2 teaching practices in primary schools, where building a curriculum around the interests of the kids and then getting them to give presentations to the class on what they'd been doing, and involving parents. It worked brilliantly in the primary schools, but I nearly got thrown out of the secondary school for doing the same thing. It was very, very authoritarian school. I won't name it, though it deserves to be named. Because
was this the place where in the book it says that you were given a satisfactory only by the school, with the comment that Mr. Hannam should understand that as a student teacher, he should not conduct inappropriate experiments in class democracy?
Yes, that's the one. The heads of the 2 primary schools where I did it said, this is great. The kids love it. The parents love it. It's great.
Yeah.
But at the secondary school, no. What some of the kids, I was supposed to be teaching them history. And one of the things I was supposed to teach them was the 1832 Reform Act, where the franchise was extended. Not that much, but the franchise was extended. More people got the vote. And we talked about democracy. And we had a democratic meeting in the class where they could make some decisions and express their views. And this was severely frowned on by the school. Yeah, I was lucky to survive that one. Fortunately, I had another primary teaching practice after that disaster that actually worked extremely well.
Yes, yeah, right. So we're fast forwarding a little bit here, and I'm really interested to get into this whole journey that you went on as a democratic teacher. Let's just rewind a little bit to something that you picked up a moment ago, where you were saying that you had this psychology lecturer who was an enthusiastic behaviorist, and I'd like to just to share an excerpt from the book, if I may, for the benefit of listeners, because I think that it's quite interesting. You were saying, I have since learned that there's a lot more to Skinner and even Pavlov than the simplistic justification for the behavior management of children that was advocated by this lecturer. Having just come from the subtleties and complexities of the ideas of Freud, Young, Klein, Erickson, Bowlby, Winnicott, and others. And this is the reading that you've done in the library as a civil servant, wasn't it?
Partly, but also when I was working in the therapeutic community.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So having just come from these ideas, which provided the theoretical underpinning to the psychiatric therapeutic community where you worked, as you just said, I could not see what Pavlov's salivating dogs and Skinner's rats pulling levers in boxes had to do with the education of children and young people. And if I may, I'll read the next paragraph as well, because I think it's really interesting. You wrote, I was more interested in ideas that would help to create a classroom that served as a holding environment within which learners could become their true selves, with all the release of energy, curiosity, collaboration, spontaneity, motivation to learn that would entail. In my view, this behaviorist behavior management approach was all about producing the easily manipulated and controlled false selves, in inverted commas, that Winnicott describes with all the associated tendencies to emptiness, depression, loss of self-esteem, and the lack of empathy that follows. Perfect material for an exploitative capitalism about which I would later learn that Frere and Habermas would have a lot to say. This was definitely not what I wanted to do with young people. And I'd just like to alight on that briefly, if we may, because this is, partly it's quite topical. Like there's a topical issue that's happening this week, which is interesting, where there are some schools, it seems, I'm not fully across the detail of this, but it seems that there's some schools that have instituted a policy where you're not allowed to go to the toilet at all during lesson time. They've just said, like, break times for using the toilet, you're not allowed to use the toilet in lesson time. And there are some schools that have even locked the toilets during lesson time. And through social media, it seems that some young people have sort of coordinated a response to this, and that there's been, like, students, I don't know, I saw the word rioting used. I don't know if it was really rioting, but there were students who were objecting, striking, who were out of lessons, who were essentially protesting against their lack of ability to access toilets. And that's just like one of many examples. It's just that it happens to be current, but it's one of many examples that we can see where this sort of, there's been this very strong resurgence in recent years of these quite sort of authoritarian approaches to behavior management, where the children are sort of micromanaged. And there are schools where people often know about silent corridors. There are also policies like you're not allowed to associate in groups of more than 4 people in the playground. If they're in a group of 5 or more, then a teacher will go over and break it up, a little bit like the criminal justice bill, breaking up illegal raves or something. There are children, schools with very, very high volume detentions, where if they don't bring a pen, if they don't have a spare pen even in their bag, when they do an equipment check, that's a detention. If they've got the wrong colored socks on, if they don't have their top button done up, like down to the tiniest little details, kids have, like, there are even some schools where you have to place your pen at right angles on the table, right? So that they're sort of like just unbelievably ordered. And the rationale for this is often that it's like the broken windows theory, like the sort of like the way that they cleaned up New York, right? The way when New York was quite lawless place with high murder rates, and they were like the broken windows approach to policing, where it's like you don't draw the line at murder, you draw the line at like jaywalking, right? And so if somebody's jaywalking, then you throw the book at them and put them in prison for 3 months, and that's where the line is. And I think that it's a bit of a crude analogy, but I think that that's essentially the thinking behind these very draconian approaches to behavior management, which is that if the argument that you're having is about whether you've got a spare pen in your bag, then we're a long way away from throwing chairs and kids walking in and out of lessons and doing as they please and telling teachers to F off and all of the things that can happen in schools when behavior gets unruly. And we had an interesting conversation about this off air when we chatted last week, because I was sort of saying that this stuff is coming from a good place. I think that the people who are advocating these approaches are, they're not just on some mad, like, egotistical power trip. Like they're doing what they genuinely think is in those children's best interests, to give them a lawful and orderly environment in which they can learn without disruption and without being bullied, for example. But we are where we are, and another, just as if I'll add one more thing, if I may. There was some research that came out yesterday. The Edge Foundation have done some research, And there was this, the headline finding was that I think it was 1 in 2 school leavers. Let me just find the quote quickly. It's right here. For 1 in 2 young people aged 15 to 16 in school leaving age, secondary school is not an enjoyable or meaningful experience, but is rather something that they feel that they need to get through or endure because of its bearing on their futures.
Well, I think 3 words come to mind, James. Democratic participation, authoritarian, laissez-faire. It seems to me you can approach school discipline, and by that I mean achieving a state of affairs where kids can learn, kids can feel safe. All that, of course, I totally agree with. And all that was achieved, if I may say so, superbly through my experience, which I write about in the book. So if you have a problem situation where there's bullying and an unsafe environment, you have to do something about it. The question is, what do you do and how did you get to that place? If you do nothing, if you just allow a laissez-faire situation to develop, that is unacceptable. If you use authority to order, punish, and regulate, it may work in the short term anyway, though it will create high levels of anxiety, and some kids, especially the neurodiverse kids, will find that environment almost intolerable. The third way is precisely my proposal. Another way is possible. The third way is a democratic participative approach, because kids don't want disorder. Kids don't want bullying. Kids want to feel safe. At the same time, they don't want to be frightened, afraid of failure, or afraid of putting a foot wrong. Or as happened to one of my grandchildren, he was put in detention and he genuinely didn't know why he'd been put in detention, which seems to me a ludicrous state of affairs. If you look at this internationally, some countries have very, very well-developed school student organisations, and they meet together in a European network based in Brussels called OBESU, the Organising Bureau of European School Student Unions. They're very, very strong, and well organised in the Nordic countries. For example, in Norway, the students have a right to negotiate school discipline with the head teacher. In Norway, ironically, the school students can speak to the regional education ombud and ask him to come to the school and arrange a meeting with the head teacher if there's bullying in the school and the head teacher is doing nothing about it. The kids can take the initiative. And if he's not careful, the head teacher could actually be prosecuted if he allowed bullying in his school and he took no action. And there you've got a structure where the kids can be organised to create the kind of environment that they want, which is almost always a non-bullying, safe, good environment for learning. And with my own democratic experiments, this is what I find kids want. They don't want bullying. And if you read I'm sure you read the chapter called Joe's Story in my book.
I was going to suggest that we fast forward to Joe's story. Let's talk about Joe.
Just one other point.
Okay.
When David Blunkett and Bernard Crick were introducing citizenship education, I got on very well with Bernard Crick. And the idea that I communicated to Bernard, sadly deceased, was that if you wanted kids to learn about democracy, they had to actually do it in school. It had to be experiential. It had to be participative. Not good enough to just listen to teachers talk about it. That can be important, but it's not the whole story. Crick and Blunkett accepted that idea. And if you remember, in the citizenship order, there is a requirement for school students to participate in democratic decision-making and responsible action. When Chris Woodhead, the chief inspector, heard about this, he started writing articles in the Daily Mail saying this is a complete waste of kids' time. They should be doing more maths, not having democratic discussions. And I got the job of looking at schools that were already much more participative than most to see what was happening there in terms of GCSE, attendance figures, and exclusion figures. And what I found, looking at schools in leafy suburbs, inner cities, and rural schools, was in every case the more participative schools that had structures that involved the kids in decision making and really listened to the kids' proposals. These schools actually got better exam results, better attendance, and fewer exclusions than average for schools in similar socioeconomic areas. So that's my answer to your question. We need to listen to the kids and create structures where their opinions are really taken seriously and something's done about them.
And so this is the so-called the Hannam Report. So I've just put it up here, a pilot study to evaluate the impact of student participation aspects of the citizenship order on standards of education, a report for the DFEE, as it was then called, in April 2001. So this is like, it's still in Labour's first term, in the first term of the new Labour administration.
Bernard Crick gave it that pompous title. And John Potter from CSV wrote a book about citizenship education, jolly good book too.
What happened to citizenship?
And he called it the Hannam Report.
Yeah.
I didn't call it that. I've never called it that. It's become known as that because Bernard Crick's title is so long and so pompous.
Yeah, they always become known as that, don't they? The Tomlinson or, Alexander or whatever. So what happened to citizenship? I'm interested because I trained as a teacher in 2005-06, and it was just sort of on its way out then. So it had petered out even before the end of New Labour. It wasn't that the coalition came in and got rid of it. It had already lost momentum. What happened?
Well, the story was David Blunkett not done very well at school. As you know, he's blind. He never felt his academic potential was taken seriously. He ended up at Ruskin College, and Bernard Crick was his tutor. And they planned. David said, one day I'm going to be Minister of Education, and when I am, you're going to become my advisor, and we're going to introduce citizenship. He did become Education Secretary, as you know.
Indeed.
And he did a deal with Blair, as I understand it, that Blair would keep Chris Woodhead as Chief Inspector, and Blunkett would get his citizenship curriculum. And so it happened. And it was very, very well organised. There was a 10-year research programme, largely managed by David Carr from NFER, to see what actually happened as the programme was introduced in schools. A little bit of Ofsted was created. Some citizenship inspectors were appointed. It was very well organised. And the curriculum, it was what Bernard Crick called a kind of a very loose curriculum, a framework. It wasn't prescribed in detail, except for this requirement that kids should participate. It should be a really experiential thing. What we found was, in English secondary schools, something like 20% of schools were already trying to do something like this, and they found citizenship order wonderful, fantastic. Now we really got power to our elbow. We can do well what we always tried to do. Another 25% of schools came on board and said, yes, well, it sounds interesting. We'll give it a try. There was another group of schools that never tried very hard, that never really got it, and not very much happened. And then there was a fourth group of schools that systematically tried to undermine it, that said, you know, where head teachers said, citizenship education over my dead body, you know. At the same time, an association was created called ACT, an Association of Citizenship Teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was given a lot of encouragement. It created a journal that Bernard Crick often wrote for. I wrote for it occasionally, always saying the same thing. If you want this to work, you've got to give the kids real responsibility, and then they'll become responsible. A bit like just saying the same thing over and over again.
Sometimes you just got to hit the same message repeatedly.
It was all very strong, and it was all going well. There was the research. Teacher training departments began to create citizenship units in some colleges of education or some departments of education. You got the research, you got the teachers' organisation, you got the curriculum, you got the teacher training, and you got the inspection. And it was all going great guns. It gradually began to, I think, decline in influence through the end of the Labour regime. I think Gordon Brown was much less interested in it. New secretaries of state for education emerged. You got the slightly problematic era where Estelle Morris was Secretary of State. She's a lovely person, and she's the only politician I've ever known who resigned because she didn't feel up to the job. But there was a kind of declining influence. And then you got the financial crisis of 2008. And then, of course, Cameron appears in 2010. And I think Gove set out, he saw citizenship education as part of the blob, and he set out to undermine it and destroy it, basically. Later, right. he changed his mind a little bit. Where Cameron became interested, you know, Cameron's big society, they did think perhaps citizenship education might contribute to that, but it steadily declined in influence. The good news is the Association of Citizenship Teachers still exists, and hopefully this part of the curriculum will re-emerge when we get another Labour government.
Well, that would be nice, wouldn't it? And I mean, it just seems like it's so obvious. It's such a shame that it petered out, and I wasn't aware that it was even still going until 2010. I thought that it had largely disappeared. I think it didn't feature in the schools that I was teaching at in the late 2000s. But it's just so obvious, isn't it, that if you're going to have a democratic society, that you need people to understand what that means, to understand like what makes up a democratic society, like how the courts function, how the law functions, how the police functions, and what democracy feels like, what it tastes like, what it feels like when a vote goes your way, what it feels like when a vote doesn't go your way, all of that stuff. But it seems like we're going in the other direction at the moment, where they're bringing in voter ID, right? So, and it seems that the effect of voter ID is that like often it's people from poor backgrounds, young people from ethnic minorities who are less likely to have photograph ID with their latest address on, and it seems like there's a move to make it harder for people to express their democratic rights, not easier. And it seems like you know, like viewed through that lens, citizenship education might be deemed to be a threat to certain parties of power, who would think, well, if we're going to, you know, like create loads of, like, kids tend to be more left wing, right? Like there's a general trend, isn't there, for young people to be more left wing and for older people to become more conservative as they get older. And so you can see how, you know, from a party political perspective, you know, equipping lots of young people with know-how and their rights and, you know, like how to express their democratic franchise is going to pose a threat to certain parties.
And yet, James, you raised the question of this schools where kids have to some extent taken the law into their own hands over the last week or so. And they've used TikTok, I think, to communicate to each other. Part of the problem here is there is no official way, as there would be in Norway, for example, if the kids felt upset that girls having periods had to wave red cards publicly in class in order to be allowed to go to the toilet. If that kind of thing had been implemented in Norway, the students' organisations, first of all, would have been consulted by government over the introduction of something like that, and the kids would have been able to come up with their own solutions, and they would have been taken seriously. In Norway, the school students' organisation would have been involved in tackling the problems. Here, although there have been several attempts to start one, there is no school students' organisation. There's no vehicle that the young people can use. To some extent, they're beginning to create their own around climate change issues. And you've got Teach the Future at last being listened to, a kids' organisation making proposals in Parliament for how climate education could be improved. But we have no overall school students' organisation. So the kids will resort to whatever methods they can because there are no official vehicles and official pathways for them to use. I wish there were. I've been involved several times in trying to get an English school students' organisation started. And you're right, the right wing fear it as dangerous lefties trying to stir up the kids. But the truth is quite different. The truth is it's trying to create responsible pathways for the kids to share some control, autonomy and agency over the way in which their schools are run. And if you want to see it in action, just go to Finland or go to Norway or go to Denmark, where there are really effective school student organisations. The chances of a riot, and I saw it was reported as a riot, where was that? The Telegraph or the Mail, probably. They need to be answered with, okay, if you want to stop irresponsible behaviour, which is what you're suggesting when you use the word riot, let's create some pathways where the kids can be responsible. And in order to become responsible, they've got to be given genuine responsibility. So I know I'm just repeating myself now, but
no, it seems so obvious. And one of the first times I really started thinking about this was around the time of the riots. Remember the riots in 2011? 2012, I think it was this August of 2011, which started in London and then they spread and there were riots all over the country. And it started with the shooting of a guy by the police. And so ostensibly there were sort of race riots, sort of Black Lives Matter type riots in the way that we saw in the wake of George Floyd's killing. But it quickly sort of became about something else. It seemed to be about like a disenfranchised class of young people for whom, you know, like lots of youth centres were being closed at the time. This was the very first year or two of austerity, like libraries being closed. Not that I'm saying that the kids are all hanging out in the libraries all the time, but you know, like public services being cut off, especially youth centres and support for kids, for young people outside of school. And people kept saying like there were these kids who were trashing their own community. I remember this Sky News reporter walking around the streets in Clapham, sort of shouting at kids, going, "Are you proud of yourself? You're trashing your local community." And everyone was genuinely confused. They were these people seemed to not want to recognize their local community as something that they were proud of. They were sort of just trashing shops and looting them, and they were saying like, "Oh, these young people have no stake in society." And I wrote an essay around that time saying that the roots of that riot were education. Not that education was a direct cause of those riots, but rather that if we had a different education system, a system that does make young people feel like they have a stake in society, that their voices are listened to and taken seriously, and that they have some ability to shape this world of ours, I think that we would see fewer disenfranchised kids, you know, looting shops on the streets.
Absolutely. And you mentioned broken windows earlier. Um, Again, in the book, there's a story about um, in the school that I'm writing about, the kids weren't allowed in the buildings at break and at lunchtime unless it was pouring with rain. And then they could go to the school hall because there had been some vandalism. And the second year that I was responsible for, the 7 classes in the second year, had a second year committee. And they had so many activities going on, they wanted to be able to use their classrooms at lunchtime. Now, it was okay if there was a teacher there, the school allowed it. But the kids wanted to carry on with activities without the teachers. The teacher wasn't always convenient to give up their lunch hour. And they did a deal with the head. They said to the head, look, we've got a bank account. We've raised money with discos and things. We guarantee if there's any damage when we're using the building at lunchtime, we, the second year, will pay for it. Well, guess what? A window got broken. A kid was running down a corridor and smashed a window in a door. The kids went to the head after they'd been to talk to the caretaker to find out how much it would cost to repair the window. And they went to the head and they said, look, we're going to have a year court. The year court will sit and decide what to do about this kid who broke the window. But in the meantime, here's £4 for the broken window. That's what the caretaker said it would cost. And the window was repaired. The head was happy. The caretaker was very happy, became a big supporter of the democratic project. And the kids fined the boy who'd broken the window. They fined him £4 and he had to pay it back 20p a week over a whole term. The interesting thing is, the head teacher said, I wouldn't have imposed such a severe penalty, but that's what the kids feel is appropriate. So I completely support it.
Mm. Yeah, and kids sort of, you're right, you know, they often come up with really creative solutions. We briefly mentioned Joe's story earlier, which is one of the short chapters from your book. But first, I'd just like to go to backtrack a little bit because we're sort of getting into the story of what happened with this in the first 2 years of your teaching career. But first, I just want to rewind slightly, if I may, and we're sort of jumping back and forth a little bit here, but that's okay. To go back to significant learning, this idea of significant learning, we heard a bit about your story, the journey that you went on in your sort of formal education, what your school experience was like, and so on, and we touched a bit upon teacher training. But I'm also interested in this idea of significant learning, this idea that comes from Carl Rogers, the learning that matters, the learning that really shapes people. So I'm interested just to hear, like, as you look back over your life, like, and this might not even be related to education, or it might be. I imagine that some of it will. But what do you see as the sort of as the pivotal moments that have really shaped you as a person? And it could be a book that you read, or a person that you met, or sort of a chance conversation that you had. What comes to mind when you think about this idea of significant learning?
Yes, the first one that comes to mind is my friend's dad, Bert Barnes. And Bert played a really important role in my life, and my own childhood wasn't all that happy. Bert provided me with 2 things. He recognised that I had musical ability, but wasn't getting on very well with formal piano lessons. So he taught me to play jazz. And that's been enormously important in my life. It's earned me quite a lot of money when I was a student. So it was a financial plus. I've earned more as a jazz musician than I probably would have done as a very second, third, fourth, fifth-rate player of Mozart. And the same man told me about Clubland, the Democratic Club in Camberwell, where these kids from semi-criminal backgrounds got started in life by being taken seriously, giving responsibility, and treated with respect by adults rather than with anxiety and fear and suspicion about what they were going to do next, treated with respect. So when I discovered people like Neil and Homer Lane, I had a kind of context in which to fit their ideas.
Yeah. And how old were you when you came across this Clubland thing?
17. I used to run. I lived in a suburb called Orpington, which is a particularly nondescript, uninspiring place. And I used to travel by train to County Hall in London every day. And I started that when I was 16. And I started traveling on the same train as Bert Barnes, I think, when I was 17. So that was about it.
I see. Yeah, I remember you writing in the book, and you used to hang out on the train and talk about democracy and jazz.
There's quite a lot of linkage in my mind between democracy and jazz. They've both got something to do with organized freedom.
Yeah, can you expand on that a little?
Well, the way I learned to play jazz was before I met Bert. I was able to pick out tunes on the piano that I listened to on the Billy Cotton band show Sunday lunchtime. And I made up little, very simple left hands to accompany the melody. And I found I could do that from the age of about 7 or 8. But my music teacher found it singularly uninteresting. But Bert didn't. Bert said, "What you're doing is really interesting, but do you know that I'll teach you about chords and improvisation?" And I thought, wow. So he showed me that a tune that I'd learned, like Sunny Side of the Street, had got a harmony, had got chords to accompany it. And if you took those chords, you could forget the tune and just make up your own tunes around that chord sequence. And I found this absolutely fantastic. So if you like, there was a structure, but there was freedom to develop it in your own way. And that applies, I think, to my feelings about education. I think oracy and literacy are incredibly important. And of course, as head of humanities with that class I worked with, I saw that as something I really had to take very seriously. Fortunately, I wasn't responsible for numeracy because I'd never heard of Joe Bowler, and I didn't know that you could teach maths in a creative way too. I thought you just had to learn it.
Yeah, in a mixed ability way. Like Joe's whole thing is mixed ability
Yeah,
teaching.
it's wonderful. I love her stuff. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it. And that makes me think about one of the first people I interviewed on this podcast. That was about a 6-hour conversation. We spread it over 2 episodes, was with Ian Cunningham. And I know that you know Ian well, and have done for many years. And Ian talks about structures for freedom. And so, like at the Self-Managed Learning College, where I had the privilege to work alongside Ian for a couple of years, it's not just a free for all. When I first tell people that this is a self-managed learning community, that the kids can do what they want, when they want, for how long, they can choose not to do stuff if they so choose, and they're aged 9 to 16. Lots of people's jaws just hit the floor, and they just go like, "What does that even look like?" Like it's really hard because it's so far removed from what we understand to be, a good standard of education. But it's not a free for all. It's not an anarchistic sort of situation in the way that people tend to think of anarchy, although Ian, I think, does describe himself as an anarchist. But anarchy's got loads of rules. The anarchists get loads of stuff done. They have lots of quite laborious meetings about things, and it's just like not being ruled by other people. But it doesn't mean that there's no structure there. And so in the Self-Managed Learning College, there's a daily meeting which is chaired by a young person. There are daily learning groups in sizes of 6. Where there's a sort of a loose accountability where you ask them what are their plans for the day, how did yesterday go. It's sort of like a daily review, if you like. And out of those structures, and Ian often talks about the metaphor of a glass. He says that the reason that a glass is useful is that it's rigid, it's strong, so you can put stuff in it, and it's see-through, so you can it's transparent, you can see whether there's stuff in there. But also, importantly, it's empty. If a glass is full of concrete or already filled with milk, then it's not much use as a glass, is it? Like for doing other things with, and for sticking some flowers in, for example. And so I can totally see what you're talking about, this idea of structures for freedom. And it feels like things are very buttoned down, aren't they, in education, in the way that we generally run schools, that there's not very much, room in the glass for the children to be making decisions about things, that it's all been sort of pre-decided by the adults, by the teachers.
Well, absolutely. I don't know whether I'd call myself an anarchist or not, but I agree with Ian's notion. In fact, I hadn't thought about Ian when I made that comment just now, but I think we completely agree. I think I said organised freedom, didn't I? Or structured freedom.
Yeah.
The point is, who makes the structures? Are they imposed from above? And that seems to me a terrible loss of learning opportunity, when creating the structures is both good fun and involves serious learning. And I was just talking about oracy and literacy. What better vehicle for oracy than the class meeting, or the meeting in the therapeutic community, or the meeting at Summerhill, where all kids learn to speak with confidence in the meeting, and all kids take responsibility and learn how to chair a meeting, which is a really important life skill, I think. And then, of course, they learn about the importance of record keeping, of minutes, and what's the best way to organise the minutes of a meeting. All these are real learning opportunities.
Absolutely.
To just come in as a teacher and say, this is how it's going to be, X, Y, and Z, you're actually depriving kids of so many learning opportunities. And it's beyond me that this isn't just obvious, which is why I enjoyed working with Bernard Crick on the citizenship curriculum, because Bernard got this, the idea of democratic participation and responsible action, not just talking, but actually doing, of making it happen, and then evaluating it afterwards. Did it work? Did it achieve what we wanted to achieve, etc., etc., etc.
So, just as a final bit, before we go back to the beginning of your career as a democratic teacher, we talked about behavior management earlier, and we were talking about some of the innovative solutions to problems that young people come up with when they're consulted about, how to address instances of misbehavior. And there's a lovely chapter in your book that's very moving. It's very short. It's only 3 pages, called Joe's Story. I wonder if you are happy to just relay your recollections of that story, and how that issue played out for your class.
Yeah, I've just got to mention the name Lawrence or Larry Kohlberg here, and his Just Community Schools in the States. And I apologize in advance to all the ladies watching this who know about Carol Gilligan, who refuted Kohlberg's claim that only men could reach the higher stages of moral development, but that they beyond women. I would just like to completely and utterly disassociate myself from that view.
Right.
But then say that there's a lot in Kohlberg that I found very interesting, the ideas of moral development. And that if young people have the opportunity to participate in moral decision-making around real issues, they actually develop morally as human beings. And Joe's story was pushed in at the end of my writing about my class as an example of this. Jo was a very troubled girl who'd been thrown out of several schools, who came from a traveller family, whose dad was in prison and being looked after by mum, and she was helping mum look after some little kids. And she'd had very unhappy experiences of school. And she applied to come to the school where I was working. And I thought, well, perhaps I'd better put her in my class, as I knew some of the story that the head had said. So, and my class was already quite large. I think there were 34 in it at that point. Anyway, Jo came into my class. She immediately made friends with some older kids and started bullying and stealing and threatening kids. And she didn't do it to kids in our class on the whole, because she knew that the class had a class meeting and a class court, and she was very wary of having to appear before the class court. But she was involved in bullying incidents with older kids and kids from other classes. And eventually it got to the point where the head said to me, look, I don't think we can cope with this. We've tried. I think she's got to go. And my class got to hear that there was a prospect of Jo being expelled. And one day after school, I was walking back to the classroom and I met some of the kids from the class. And they said to me, oh, Derry, we're going to have a meeting to discuss what we can do to help Jo, because we think she's in serious trouble. And they said something that always tickled me was, this boy, Andrew, who's chair of the class meeting, said to me, you can come if you want to. We're going to have a meeting. You can come if you want to, which I thought was rather nice. And of course, I did want to. And we went, about half the class attended this meeting after school. Jo, of course, wasn't there. Half the kids who had to go on school buses to get home weren't there. So it was the remainder, about 15 kids. And we sat round in a circle and talked about why was Jo behaving like this? Why wasn't she behaving like this in our class? And what could we do to help her? And various ideas came up. I remember vividly one boy called David saying, we should speak to her nicely on Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays, and not speak to her at all on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and see which is the best way of changing her behaviour. Well, the rest of the class didn't think much of that. And eventually they decided that the chief magistrate, another David, would resign, and the chair of the meeting would also resign. And both these jobs, which were quite prestigious in the class, it really mattered to the kids doing these jobs, being elected to them. Both those jobs, we had a vote there that both those jobs should be given to Jo, and that the best way to help Jo learn to be more responsible was to give her responsibility. Now, I swear that that idea it was not fed into the discussion by me. It absolutely came from the kids. And the next day, the class, we had a class meeting at the beginning of the day. It was humanities morning. And Jo was told that she'd been elected to both these jobs. And she ran out of the room in tears, and we had to go and fetch her. She came back into the room and tearfully said, I don't know what to do. She said, nobody's ever been kind to me in school before. And so the story, and she did the jobs, by the way. She was class magistrate and she was chair of the class meeting for a while, but then her family moved on and she left the school and we never heard any more about her. But it did work. The kids' solutions to the problems that Jo was facing worked. They were kind to her, they trusted her, and they gave her responsibility. And it almost brings tears to my eyes telling the story, because it's a beautiful example for me that by being together for 2 years, solving problems together, learning to live together, these kids had really developed a moral compass that was quite unusual.
Yeah, absolutely. It is an incredibly moving story, and again, for the benefit of listeners, I'd like to just share the final paragraph of that short chapter, where you wrote that the action of the class over the Jo incident haven't had an indelible effect on me. The ex-students with whom I'm still in contact over 40 years later remember it vividly. It was a solution that no adult could ever have contrived. And I was thinking about that the other day, like if you had fed that in, if you had said to the kids, hey, why don't we have a rigged election where we sort of pretend like there's these spaces have become available and that we'll vote Jo in. I don't think that they would have wanted to go along with it. It was the fact that they owned that solution, I think, that made it so effective. And then you go on in this section. It says it was a moral act of a high order. Kohlberg would have instantly recognized the learning that must have occurred over the previous terms that the class had been together that allowed such morally mature actions to be possible. It did not happen by chance. It was nurtured in an empowered democratic environment in which 34 young people had the opportunity to learn experientially how to take responsibility for themselves and each other. Above all, they had learned to have empathy and that kindness was not the same as weakness. And it justified the whole project beyond my wildest dreams. And then you go on to say, again, as you just said, that it still reduces you to tears just thinking and writing about it. It is an incredible example, Derry, of what's possible when we take these things seriously.
I think kindness, and how do you equate kindness with some of the behaviour management stuff that's going on now? Not being allowed to turn around in class until you're told to, not being allowed to talk in the corridor. My God, these, to me, I'm afraid, epitomise unkindness. Why would you want to treat young human beings in this way? And what do you expect them to take away from that kind of treatment? Do the people who run these behaviour management systems really believe they're creating better people? Well, perhaps that's a discussion for next time.
Yes. Okay. Well, let's park that for now. Thank you, Derry. I really enjoyed this conversation, as I expected I would. Derry Hannam, welcome back to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Hello, James. Good to be back.
So we're going to continue the conversation that we started last week by getting into the story of what happened all those years ago. And just to frame this, I'd just like to briefly touch upon my own experience in education recently, because there are remarkable similarities with what you did back in the early 70s, where I was working at a school. It wasn't a secondary modern because they don't exist anymore, but it was a very low achieving state comprehensive community school. And it was in special measures. So, and it had, a history of declining results. And we had a new head teacher come in, and he wanted to obviously get the school out of special measures. And that usually involves sort of quick fixes, just like getting the teachers to mark their books every week and all of that stuff, lots of scrutiny and lesson observations and what have you. But he was also interested in implementing long-term, cultural change at the school. And one thing that he did was to implement a year 7, what was initially described as a learning to learn curriculum, and became known as the learning skills curriculum. And we were given the whole of year 7 for 5 lessons a week. So it was, funnily enough, because you advocate for 20% of curriculum time to be given over to self-directed learning. So 5 out of 25 lessons a week. So we essentially had a whole day a week. And those lessons were together in that first year. We had the whole of Monday afternoon and then the whole of Tuesday morning, which was amazing. And it was very self-directed. It was lots of project-based learning, lots of philosophical inquiries. We sat in circles a lot. But I really wish that your book had come out like 15 years ago, and that I'd read it then. And likewise, that I'd just read more widely around democratic education, because you had found those books on a dusty corner of the bookshelf as you described it last week, and they're not widely read, particularly these days. Lots of people are reading books about cognitive science. They're not really reading books about democratic ways of teaching and learning in a participatory way, so that young people experience what it's like to participate in a democratic community. And I think that was really missing. And if I had read your book then, because it's such a rich account of what it was really like in the classroom, and that's what we're going to get into today, I would have been absolutely right up that drain pipe and wanting to pursue that and explore it for all it was worth. So let's get into last week we heard a lot about your history and moments of significant learning and so on. Let's start today's conversation with teacher training, with you deciding to become a teacher, having read these books, which some might describe as radical. I don't think they're particularly radical. They should be mainstream, but they are on the fringes, say. How did you approach teacher training? What was that like for you?
It wasn't particularly straightforward because I think, as last time I mentioned, I'd come into teacher training not entirely cold in terms of working in a democratic way, because I'd worked in a psychiatric therapeutic community, mainly with younger people, and we had the treatment was essentially learning to live together, understand ourselves better than others, and it was successful in the sense that the readmission rate was pretty much the same as other communities or other parts of psychiatric hospitals where the treatment had been based on medication, on chemotherapy, on physical treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, and even on brain surgery was still going on at that time. So I didn't come into teacher training cold. I had some ideas about what could be learned in communities and how important it was to live in a community. I had read a bit about Summerhill before I got to teacher training. But I was a bit upset, I think I probably mentioned this last time, to find that basically the psychology that we were learning was behaviorist. Skinner and his rats, Pavlov and his salivating dogs, etc. And I found this a bit upsetting and said to the lecturer, look, I want to teach kids, not rats. And he sort of let me off a lot of his lectures. I think he was glad to see the back of me because I was a bit disruptive. And he let me go to the library. And there I found there was much more than A.S. Neil and Summerhill. There was a whole lot of stuff about democratic experiments and learning communities. People like Homer Lane, Bertrand Russell, who I knew a little bit before I got to the college. People like Tolstoy, Dewey, Homer Lane.
I didn't know that Russell had been involved in democratic education.
Oh, yes, he and his wife, Dora, started a school called Beacon Hill at roughly the same time that A.S. Neil was starting Summerhill.
Right.
And this was in the 1920s. And Russell didn't think much to his own education and wanted to do something completely differently. And the Currys at Dartington, they were all into this at roughly the same time as Neil. Anyway, I'd read all this stuff, and of course I'd read quite a bit of psychology before I got to the college from when I was working in the therapeutic community. And I discovered people like Winnicott, who talks about agency and belonging and good enough parenting. Very interesting guy, David Winnicott. And I read a bit of Jerome Brumer with his 3 C's, his ideas that young people are innately curious, innately collaborative, and innately love to develop competence at whatever it is. They just love to feel competent. So Bruner's 3 C's, I knew about this stuff. So I took it all with me into teaching practices in 2 primary schools, and they were pretty wildly successful. The first primary school was in a fairly poor part of South Oxford. The class teacher was ill. The head was delighted to have someone take over the class. And he didn't bother too much about what he did, as long as not too many of the kids got sent to him. So we sat in a circle, talked about learning, talked about what they'd been learning, talked about what they wanted to learn. And as far as possible in the 6 weeks teaching practice, the kids studied things they were interested in. But at the same time, we were using the circle for a morning meeting, and if necessary, an afternoon meeting as well, to talk about just how we're going to manage the whole thing. I had a lot of support quite quickly from parents, interestingly, because the class had had a whole string of supply teachers. and they were glad to have a little bit of stability. The head was delighted because the parents got interested. And at the end of the 6 weeks, the kids presented their projects to the rest of the class. And some of the parents came, and of course the head teacher came. And he was as chuffed as hell, gave me a very, very shining report from the school. My second teaching practice was an absolute disaster. Did I mention this last time? It was in a secondary school where it was very authoritarian. I was supposed to teach history to 13, 14-year-olds. And interestingly enough, the history I was supposed to be teaching covered the Industrial Revolution and the Reform Acts of 1832. So I was able to bring democracy into the classroom and have meetings, kind of mini parliaments in the class. But unfortunately, the kids used this as an opportunity to say how much they dislike the subject, dislike the teacher, and dislike the school. And this got back to the staff room, that I was having these kind of discussions with the kids, and it was immediately and severely shut down. My tutor from college was told to keep an eye on me, and from then on, the class teacher sat in the back of my class. I mean, the next thing I tried to do was split the curriculum up with different kids researching bits of it they were interested in, and then teaching the lessons with me picking up any serious errors that they made. And this was forbidden as well. I wasn't allowed to have the class teach itself, as it were. And the teachers sat in the back of it was an absolute catastrophe. I thought, bugger this, I've had enough of teaching. If this is what it's all about, it's not for me. But my tutor, who'd been the same tutor I'd had in the primary school, said, no, don't give up, Derry. I saw what you did in the primary school. It was wonderful. Please don't leave. So I thought, all right, well, I'd got 2 kids by this stage, so I thought we'll give it a bit longer. And then I had a third teaching practice, also in a primary school, in a much more middle-class area. I described this in the book. I must be careful not to slander anybody, but the class teacher was an ex-army officer. And I was expecting to take control of the class. It was my last teaching practice. And he said to me, oh, what do you intend to do? And I thought, how much shall I actually say? And I said, well, I'd really like to try a democratic approach with a class meeting and the kids using our time together to study things they're really interested in. They knew which secondary school they were going to. There was no 11 plus in Oxford. To my shock, instead of saying over my dead body, or I don't want anything to do with it, this guy said to me, I've always wanted to try something like that. He said, can we do it together? And I thought, oh, God. And I said to my tutor, I said, what do you think? Can I insist on sole charge of the class? He said, well, yes, you could, but it's probably not a very good idea politically. And then this guy and I worked together. We set up the class meeting. The kids worked on their own projects for 6 weeks. We got the parents involved again, and we had an end of 6-week presentation. And that was wonderful. The head joined in. He was very, very interested in horses and ponies, and so were some of the kids. It was a fairly posh area. And the head did a presentation with some kids. It was really fantastic. And I got sort of a star for my final teaching practice. So that was the teaching practices. Yeah, 2 successes and 1 catastrophe. And it made me feel I can't possibly work in a secondary school with all this discipline and all this subject stuff all the time and this endless testing, that I'm going for the primary sector. Then a job came up as a humanities teacher in a secondary modern school. I was offered jobs in 1 or 2 private alternative schools, but I thought it's not really what I want to do. I want to work with where most of the kids are, including the kids from backgrounds like me. so I took this job as a humanities teacher. It sounded really good in a secondary modern school, where the head was trying to introduce some of the continuity of the primary school and the possibility for teachers to have a closer relationship with the kids by not breaking up the curriculum into lots of subjects and lots of teachers. But in year 7, having one teacher teach all the humanities subjects, and it was about 50% of the school week.
Yeah, and that was something that the guy who I mentioned earlier, the head teacher who came to our school, they'd previously tried something like that. And Kate McAllister, who I co-wrote the book with, as you know, she ran that project while it was at this previous school, and it was they found it was good in some ways, but also really challenging in terms of lesson planning and for the teachers to be across the detail of 5 or 6 different subjects. They found it difficult. I think they called it the primary model, and then they moved away from that. How did you find that, like her teaching? Because you were teaching, was it English, RE, geography, history?
Social studies was
Social
also on the
studies.
curriculum as a separate item in year
And that
7.
wasn't that when you introduced at the start of the lesson, one kid said, "So are we just learning about everything in the whole of existence?"
Oh, lovely. David, yes. I'm still in touch with David. In fact, he's written a little bit about himself in the book. He's a very self-effacing character even now, but who went on to lead quite a confident life. And part of it he attributes to our experience of the democratic learning community between 11 and 13.
Yeah.
But I said to them that, yes, English is how we communicate. History is about what happened in the past. Geography about how different parts of the world work. Social studies is about how people live together. And RE is about what people believe. And he immediately twigged. He was, because he was terribly interested in football. And he suddenly realized football fell into several of those categories. So he said to me, does that mean that sounds like the whole world? Can we study anything we like in the whole world? It was a lovely start to our work together. Yeah.
Amazing. And so before we get into this, I just want to briefly touch on some of the key ideas that shaped your thinking before we get into 1H and 2H. And I love that bit. I almost sort of got like hair standing up on my neck when I just read about the first lesson, walking into a classroom, setting out the chairs into a circle. The kids have never sat like that before. And it's almost like something that you can imagine being filmed, those like teacher movies that you see sometimes, because it's a paradigm shifting thing that you did. But just to sort of expand a little bit on some ideas that you wrote about in the book, you were talking about that there were 4 key ideas that shaped your thinking around this time, around democracy, obviously, around human rights, and we now have some schools call themselves rights respecting schools. And this is an interesting time to be having this conversation, as the UK seems to be on the brink of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. Community and sustainability. And there was a passage that really stood out where you wrote that the planet needs a generation of young people who have learned how to live together peacefully, how to manage the stresses of community. I love that, the stresses of community, because it's complicated, isn't it? Kate uses this phrase, teaching young people how to live in a world that's made of other people. And other people, was it Sartre who said, hell is other people? Like, it's really difficult to live in a world that's made of other people, because other people have got different ideas and different beliefs and values to you. And we all sort of need to find a way to get our needs met while sharing this life on this big blue ball with 6 billion other people. And it's complicated. So the stresses of community, I thought that was interesting. How to share and respect interdependence and diversity, he wrote. How to cultivate creativity and problem solving, and how to explore sustainability in the everyday shared management of their schools. Again, we throw away so much plastic. We don't live sustainably. We don't live within our means. And we're not learning what that looks like at the level of being a child. And so how do we expect adults to live sustainably? And then, if I may, I'd just like to share one more passage for the benefit of listeners, where you just outlined those 4 key ideas. And then you were saying that there were 3 organizing ideas behind your approach to teaching this class, which then grew into a whole year group, as we'll hear. First, that it should demonstrate an intrinsic respect for, excuse me, I'll do that again. So you wrote, the three organizing ideas behind my project were first, that it should demonstrate an intrinsic respect for and trust in young people as individual human beings with an inherent capacity for learning in a way that conventional authoritarian schooling did not. Second, that the ideas would enhance learning through rebuilding the confidence of these kids who had just experienced the trauma, as you describe it, of failing the high stakes 11 plus exam. And this was a second, you just said that there wasn't an 11 plus in the school that you were at, in the trainee school, but it was a secondary modern, wasn't it? The school that you went on to work in this humanities role.
Absolutely, yeah.
Where all of those kids were there because they'd failed the 11 plus.
Yeah.
And third, that they would provide an experiential preparation for life in a democratic society. And again, that should be a no-brainer. Like, if we talk about the importance of democracy, and politicians are often doing that, why are we not teaching young people not about democracy, not to teach about, like here's how a democracy works, but actually to live it, to feel what it feels like to vote on things, to understand different types of voting, to take part in participatory decision making that affects your own life, to understand what that feels like, and the machinations of how that works, and how empowering that is to have your voice heard, but also the frustrations that come along with democracy, the tyranny of the majority, and all of that. And so this stuff should be mainstream, in my view, and the fact that it's not is something that we'll maybe come back to towards the end of this conversation. But I just wanted to share that, just for the benefit of listeners, that these were the sort of the organizing ideas that were shaping your thinking at the time. And so now let's take us to this, if you will, to this moment. Do you remember what you were feeling? Did you feel a sense of, I mean, having tried it a little bit on your training placements, you probably felt a little bit more confident. But as you were setting that room out into a circle, like, I can remember the bell going in my first lessons as a trainee teacher. I can remember the bell going and my heart pounding, just like panic stations. I was like, oh my God, they're coming, like this sort of sense of, it's a very heightened moment, isn't it? That initial thing. So if you would take us back to that first session, and then just walk us through this journey that you went on with this class, saying, we're going to do this in a different way. We're going to decide. And you use this phrase, making it up as we went along, which sounds almost sort of cavalier and like it's just like unplanned and therefore chaotic. But that's really how you have to do this stuff. So describe to us this process of making it up as you went along with this class, if you will.
Well, the ideas, the organizing ideas, the philosophy, you like, was firmly in place. The question is, how would you implement it? And that was what had to be made up as we went along, because every situation is different and you've got to think it out again. But that day was fairly amazing. I'd been able to get to my classroom at about 8:15 in the morning, and set up the room that I knew was going to be my classroom for the humanities class, which 50% of the week, and it was going to be my history teaching room for the other periods that I was teaching. So I was able to get the room organized in a circle and get the teacher's desk right to the back or front, I can't remember where. And then I had to go to the hall, and the 230 new kids were all there, and their names were read out, and different teachers led off the group that had been called after their name. And I led my group off up a couple of flights of stairs, and I went into the classroom. I don't think I was first in. Probably I was, actually. I went into the classroom. Anyway, and I sat down in the circle. And I said, come in. And I didn't really say anything else. Take a seat, probably, I said. And they came in and they weren't quite sure what to do because they couldn't see the desks. The desks had all been shoved back and stacked up on top of each other. So they came in and they sat down. Some took a long time. And one or two said, where should we sit, sir? And I just sort of said, well, in a seat. And then I explained who I was. I was a bit naughty right from the start, which was I told them my first name. One of the experiences I'd never forgotten, during my training, I'd met Jeff Cooksey, who became the head of the Stantonbury campus, which, interestingly enough, I had a little bit to do with, because Tim Brighouse had a big say in designing it, I think. And Tim Brighouse's wife was part of my team eventually. But yes, and so we sat down and I explained to them my name, and that please, in the classroom, they could call me Derry, but outside the classroom, I'd be grateful if they called me Mr. Hannam, because that was what was done in the school, and I didn't want to get the sack, which got a little ripple of laughter. And then I said, well, we've got this room of 34 people, and we've got, which was ridiculous, wasn't it? A class of 34. It was a generously sized classroom, but the average first year class, in order to keep the older kids in fairly small classes, the numbers were piled up in year 7 and year 8, as it is now. Anyway, I explained to them what humanities was, and that's when we had a discussion and they asked questions. And of course, some kids didn't say anything, and some kids said too much and didn't listen to each other. It was what you would have expected. So I just picked up a book off my desk and I said, look, let's only speak when we're holding the book. And let's, when we're not holding it, really listen to what other people are saying. And then what do we do when we finish speaking? Oh, well, give the book to somebody else who wants to speak. How do we know they want to speak? They put their hand up. Okay, and what happened was the book got passed backwards and forwards between a few kids who knew each other. So I put my hand up and they got a bit of a shock. They expected me to just take the book, which I didn't do. I put my hand up and the book was duly given to me. In fact, the problem at that stage was helping kids. If I put my hand up, I made it clear that when we were in our class meeting, I would try and stick to the same rule as everybody else. Anyway, I put my hand up. I said, look, everybody isn't getting a go. You shouldn't just, perhaps we shouldn't just pass it to people we know. And that was, I think I put that to the vote. I can't remember what the first vote was, but we introduced the first, I've got the book here, I'll have to look it up. But the idea of voting came along very quickly. And then the idea of not having a book, but having a person who would decide who would speak next. And the idea of a chairperson and what a chairperson does. Then, of course, we started to make decisions. And it's always possible to do something. Young teachers often say to me, how do we make a start? How can we cope in this environment we're expected to cope in now? I say you can always make a start, and you can make a start with a class meeting, because whenever you jam 30-odd kids into one room, you're going to have issues to discuss. So there's going to be no problem with an agenda. And then we introduced the idea of a class secretary, the idea of agenda, the idea of minutes, etc. It just came naturally, one thing after another.
Yeah, but they're already learning there, really useful stuff for life. And also, as many teachers will attest, teachers are often not particularly good at chairing meetings. Like, there are lots and lots of teachers that I know who complain of having to sit through long meetings where they're sort of talked at. People often say that could have been an email. Like, you didn't ask for anybody else's opinion. There was no sort of dialogue there. And also, people sort of talking off task, and it's a tough set of, not tough, but it's it's quite an exacting role, isn't it? The role of a chair of a meeting. And so right from this first lesson, they're learning these really, really valuable life skills.
I think chairing a meeting was terribly important for developing oracy and developing empathy.
Yeah.
And they got very good at it. And chairing the meeting was something that regularly rotated. Everyone in that class during the course of the first year had the opportunity several times to chair the class meeting.
Yeah.
The role that I think we should have shared more than we did was the role of class secretary. And I do explain in the book that one particular boy, and the girls were a bit miffed because they thought this was a girl's job. But in fact, the way we did it was when we wanted a secretary, what are the qualities that you need of a good secretary? Because I was always trying to get away from just voting for your friends or voting for someone who was popular. But when we created a role, the voting would be who would really do it well. And different people who wanted to do it did a bit of writing, did a bit of recording of an item in the discussion. And then everyone looked at these bits of writing, and the boy the student who won was a boy, and he kept the job, in fact, right through 2 years. Perhaps a mistake, others should have had the opportunity, but it became so important to him, and he did it so well.
Yeah, and you wrote about that in the book, and that he had sort of had some difficulties, and like you said, it sort of became important to him. And the other students were they asking, can we do that? Or...
Yes, what we did was we created shortly afterwards the class newspaper, and that offered massive opportunities for people to write. And we had editors for everything under the sun, James. You couldn't imagine we had a wedding dresses editor, would you? Could you imagine that? We had a model railways editor. We had umpteen editors who were in charge of their own columns in the newspaper, and they would do the writing. But then other people who wanted to write, say, a report of a football match, they would check it out with the sports editor that it was okay and there was a bit of space. And gradually it started on the back wall. Then it moved to the side wall. Then it moved to the pillars between the windows. And eventually, because I didn't often use it, it took over the blackboard and the whole front wall of the class until basically it was absolutely fascinating. And of course, the wonderful thing was they were writing for audience, not just writing in an exercise book.
Yeah.
So getting it right, kids would spend ages getting every little spelling and bit of punctuation right because they didn't want their column to look stupid when other people read it. It was a superb way of developing English skills.
And calling it a newspaper it seems to be a bit of a genius move, because as far as I know, it wasn't ever published in a magazine format for other people to read. It was literally just displaying their work on every surface of the walls. Is that correct?
Well, it was everything that they were interested in. It wasn't just what they were doing in their own projects. So you could be doing a project on the canals of Aylesbury. At the same time, you could write a report for the class cricket match. You didn't have to stick to it, but the important thing was the editors of the different columns were elected. So the editor of the sports column changed several times. That was a very popular column, whereas the editor of the drama club, the drama column, was really one person. And I think there were two people interested in the wedding dress column, but people did read each other's columns.
And there was lots of poetry written, I understand.
Yeah, well, the poetry was very interesting. One particular boy who, looking back, his dad was an academic. I think he was just a teeny weeny bit on the spectrum, we might say. But he'd never really written anything very much in primary school, his parents told me. One time they used to ask me about poetry, and they used to ask me to read. And I love it. And I'm a jazz musician. I also did quite a bit of jazz and poetry at one stage. And so I would read them bits and pieces that caught my eye. And then some of them began to write poetry in their columns. We had a poetry column, but eventually it became so popular that we created poetry anthologies of kids writing. And then one of the lovely things happened. Whereas some of the staff in the school thought I was crackers, the people who on the whole didn't were the arts teachers. And the art teacher discovered that these kids were writing a lot of poetry, and he used their poetry in his art lessons, which was a wonderful bit of integration, which the head was delighted by. And we had a drama teacher as well, and drama was a separate subject, not in the humanities. And the drama teacher would use the kids' poetry anthologies as ideas for little productions. And then, of course, we developed a class drama club, and kids began writing their own plays as well. And that spread into the whole year group in the second year of the project. We had a second year drama club, and kids were writing and performing plays. And the drama teacher thought this was wonderful because he could use his lesson to build skills which were then used by the kids in their drama clubs.
Yeah, thank you. And so what proportion, so after you'd had this initial like class meeting and so on, you said that you had 50% of curriculum time as this humanities teacher covering these 5 topics. What to what extent was that 50% of the curriculum time spent with the pupils working on like self-directed projects?
What
extent were you teaching a preordained curriculum?
And this is where the politics come in. When I was appointed, the head teacher made it very clear he didn't really require subject teaching in the first year. He hoped to see something much more integrated happen, much more like the kids' experience in the primary school. So I knew I had support from above, as it were, when the heads of the departments who'd lost bits of their territory to this lower school humanities lark, the heads of geography or the heads of history, the head of English especially, they saw humanities as a bit of a threat to their kingdoms, as it were. You know what secondary schools are like. But fortunately, I knew I had the support of the head. What happened was the heads of the departments of the various subjects in the humanities program bombarded me with prescribed requirements that I should teach about the irrigation of the Nile in geography, that I should do Tutankhamun in history or whatever, and that I should do regular braces in English, for example. Well, basically, I suppose I chucked the whole lot in the bin, but I had to go through the motions of doing some of it in order to keep these heads of department off my back, which is what I did. I took the more interesting bits and pieces, or the bits and pieces I thought were more interesting, and said to the kids, look, you could choose to do this worksheet on the Shadoof or this worksheet on the mountains of the Balkans or whatever, if you want to, and you can do it in groups if you want to. And then the same with the history. Some of the kids were interested in Tutankhamun, some of the kids were interested in medieval village life. And so they would get into groups and do the official subject worksheets. But I was a bit going through the motions. So I suppose in terms of time, they would have had 20 or 30% self-directed time. 10% of the time we probably spent having meetings, and 10% of the time was allocated to the humanities subjects as discrete subjects.
Right. Amazing. And again, you know, I imagine that some people who might be listening to this might just be like shocked and possibly even appalled at the idea that young people, like there's been this hard shift in this very traditionalist direction. This idea of the teacher as the expert at the front of the room. The children are novices and cannot be trusted to undertake their own learning projects because they'll just bake in misconceptions, and time is precious, and we need to close the disadvantage gap, and there's a moral imperative and all of that. And so the idea that you would take such a sort of a huge step back. And by the way, this is something that we did as well, because we thought we want these kids to be able to learn how to learn under their own steam when there isn't a teacher to tell them what to do and when and how and so on. And you can't they can't do that when the teacher is micromanaging everything that they do, setting targets and deadlines, and then swooping in and intervening if it looks like kids are not going to hit those deadlines. So we very consciously took a step back as well, and you have to do that quite judiciously, because some kids really flounder. When I don't know if you found this, when you set a kid off on a big long-term project like this, you can study that David who said, can we just study anything in the world, sir? That's really overwhelming for kids who have previously been told, write the date, underline it, put your pen down, look over here, listen to me. Everything's sort of micromanaged to 1 or 2 minutes, or answer questions 1 to 5. Then we'll have a talk about them, sort of thing. Some kids really flounder at first in that environment. And I think that it's important to let them flounder for a certain amount of time, because they need to know what it feels like when they don't know how to do stuff, as a way to motivate them to develop those capabilities. But equally, you don't want to be so sort of laissez-faire, if you like, that they just flounder for the whole year, right? And so there needs to be a degree of intervention. I wonder if you can recall, any examples of that sort of thing happening.
Well, I agree with what you've just said. It's true. What I found is when the kids started to work on their own projects, they didn't have to work on their own. In fact, quite the contrary. If a group of people wanted to work together, that was great. So sometimes someone who wouldn't have been able to get it going on their own was able to draw in other people. That was one thing. And also, the prescribed work from the subject departments was always there. So if a kid wanted to just work on geography, history, and English worksheets, the sort of stuff that was fed down to me to use, I didn't stop them. I mean, I'm exaggerating when I said I threw them in the bin. I didn't place enormous emphasis on them, and it didn't worry me if every kid didn't get through every one. Let's put it that way. But what I found was, James, a certain number of kids had had a little bit of freedom in primary school and certainly had passionate interests in things. And immediately, I would say half the class grabbed the opportunity to launch into studying stuff that they were really interested in.
Yeah.
And the rest gradually got drawn in.
That's what we found as well, very much that.
And I regarded my role. Sometimes I called myself, they used to say, Derry, you're always asking questions. And this was true. This is how I saw my job, Mr. Question Master. Whatever the kids were doing, I would try and deepen their demand they were making on it. I would try and deepen their awareness and understanding by endlessly asking questions. You could call it a Socratic method, if you like. And the kids sort of made a joke about it, because they knew whenever I'd come up and look at what they were doing, I'd start asking questions. Oh, what are you going to ask us today? But that's basically what I saw my job as, deepening their understanding. And of course, we didn't have the internet now. Then all I had was books, newspapers, stuff kids brought in from home, or sometimes interviews. They'd go out and interview people in the town, or they'd interview their parents, but I didn't have the internet. So the prospect of copying and pasting a big chunk of stuff wasn't there. And of course, in a way, that was an advantage, but of course it was a disadvantage too. You didn't have that wonderful access to all the information in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was also, that was strongly echoed in my experience, that when you set young people off on those long-term projects, like you say, about 50% of them crack straight on, and then they're busily, working away, and that frees you up as a teacher. Whereas, in this sort of top-down model, the teacher is very much sort of just restrained and restricted to the front of the room, and you don't get to spend anywhere near as much time with the kids, really getting to know them. And when you work in this way, I would describe it just as a coaching role, essentially. Like the role of the questioner, to just ask them questions, trying to not ask too many leading questions, but just trying to help them to explore things from a number of different angles, so that they could figure out their own way, rather than giving them solutions straight off the peg. But it's a really enriching way to teach. I loved teaching in that way, because you get to spend much more time in one-to-one and small group conversations with your pupils, and you really get to know them.
Could it might ease people's feelings about my irresponsibility if I say I did take, I wasn't responsible for maths, so I didn't have to worry about numeracy. But I was very concerned with literacy and oracy. And I introduced surreptitiously a reading test that I found at the college. I wasn't given a reading test by the English department, but I found one in the college. And I made a bit of a game about it. Anyone at any time could come up and ask me if they could do the reading test. So it caught on. It was a bit of fun. Do the reading test, see how far you can get this time. And what I found was all the kids were within about 6 months of their prescribed reading age. These were 11 plus failures, remember, so-called, but a significant portion of the kids were way ahead on reading. And by the time we'd been together for a year, an awful lot of the kids read straight off the end of the reading test. They could read the whole lot.
That's amazing. And it's not surprising either, because you had given them a reason to write. There was an authentic audience for the writing that they were doing, and so they were motivated to write legibly and to get their spellings corrected, because you don't want to have your work up on the wall and people to be pointing out errors and so on. And so it makes it a bit sharpened. But there were also some other testing, wasn't there? Because there was, as this sort of started to ripple out through the school, I understand that there was a few, not everybody was on board with it, shall we say. And at one point, there was a test done with comparing the class that was 1H and then grew into 2H, comparing them with the other classes who weren't in this democratic environment, who were having much more sort of standard subject teaching, if you like. And am I right in summarizing that they did much better than the other kids, and you were almost embarrassed by that?
It was very embarrassing. I mean, basically, I was one of 7 first-year humanities teachers, and I was the only one initially working in the democratic way with the class meeting and then the class court, which caught on and attracted some interest in the national press, which was actually very friendly and not at all critical.
That's right.
But I was one of 7 teachers, so I quietly worked in my own way. The head of year, who was responsible for the team, had been head of geography in another school. He was a lovely bloke. He knew I was doing these unusual things, and he never raised any objections at all. But of course, the kids began to talk to kids in other classes. And then I had the embarrassing experience of a parent writing to the head saying they very much liked what Mr. Hannam was doing. Could their child be transferred into his class? And that was very, very difficult to deal with. I said, no, I'd got too many already and I couldn't take any more. But the reason was, of course, that I didn't want to be seen to be poaching a kid, one of the most high achieving kids in another class, into my class. That was extremely difficult. The test you talk about was towards the end of the first year, the head had 2 anxieties. He was anxious about whether the whole thing was working across the 7 classes. And he was especially anxious about this lunatic that he'd allowed to work in the democratic way. So he imposed this test, which none of us had heard of, and I've never heard of since, called the Bristol Attainment Test. Do you know it?
No, but it sounds a bit like an IQ type test, like cognitive attainment testing. Is it like non-verbal reasoning and all that stuff?
Yeah, there was some non-verbal stuff in it. It was a bit like the 11 plus, and then there was quite a big general knowledge component as well. Well, yes, my class came out quite a bit in front of the average for all the other classes, which of course was a great relief for the head. There was a bit of muttering in the staff room. Of course, Hannam's got all the middle class kids from such and such primary school in his class. I'm surprised that the other teachers in the team put up with me, really. They were all very nice about it and nobody made a fuss. But the head was very, very reassured. He was reassured by the whole year group's performance. And I suppose he was especially reassured by this class that was doing things slightly unusually, wasn't falling massively behind.
And then in the second year, this grew into a whole year group, didn't it? So 1H went into 2H, and you carried on teaching 2H, didn't you? But that was the only democratic class in the second year. But then the whole of the first year became democratic. Is that correct?
Well, what had happened during the first year was some of the younger teachers in the team, and to their enormous credit, two of the older and much more experienced teachers began to get the message via kids in their class that, Derry's class or Mr. Hannam class does this and does that. Can we do it? And it had spread a bit. And again, to their credit, nobody said, well, I don't care what he does in his class. This is what we do in my class. There was none of that. There was from the rest of the school, and there was from some of the other subject teachers who taught my class, for example, mathematics. That was a problem, because some of the methods they invented for running the class, they tried to do it in their maths lessons and got into trouble. Oh, that was
right. That was the thing when students wanted a bit of quiet time. Sorry, do you want to take a moment?
Yeah, I'm okay.
When students wanted a bit of quiet time, they came up with a system where one of them would just put their hand up, and then if five kids had their hands up, their left hand, is that correct? The right hand was to flag the teacher. The left hand was to ask for silence because the noise was getting too high. And
yes.
It's such a classic thing that no teacher would ever think of that system, but it seemed to work quite well. And if 5 of them raised their hand, then they would have 10 minutes of silent working.
Right, 5 minutes. It varied. The meeting explored different ways, but we were discussing minority rights. And the idea of 5 people meant that meant 26 people didn't want it quiet, but 5 people did. So to respect that minority, we would have a law that gave them some cover, as it were. And the law was something like this: if 5 hands went up, there would be 2 minutes, 3 minutes, it varied, 5 minutes. That was the most, 5 minutes quiet. There'd be a class timekeeper. First of all, one of the kids had the job of saying, 5 minutes quiet, because they count the number of hands going up. 5 minutes quiet. The room would absolutely go completely quiet. And the timekeeper would time the 5 minutes. And then she would say, or he, 5 minutes up, and then everyone could talk and go and borrow pencils again or whatever they were doing. And what happened was, of course, I thought this was fantastic. And the kids began whispering in quiet times. And it didn't bother me because the room had pretty well gone quiet, and that was what we were after. But it bothered the kids. They said, this isn't good enough. Kevin keeps whispering in quiet times. And so we talked about that in the meeting. What can we do about it? Well, we got a law that says you should be quiet if 5 hands go up. What if people break the law? And I explained how the court system worked and what the police did. They said, we'd better have a class court then. So they did. After Friday meeting, we had Friday afternoon, the last thing would be a class court. And if anyone spoke more than 5 times in a week, in a quiet time, they'd be brought up before the court. And by this time, the kids had made lots of other laws as well. So if you broke the law, you'd be brought up in front of the class court. And that would be the room arranged like a courtroom with a dock and 3 elected magistrates with a hammer instead of a gavel. And we'd have the class court. And it really worked brilliantly. Kids didn't want to be put into the court. And those kinds of ideas, yes, did begin to spread out into the other classes. So at the end of the first year, the head said, I want to put you in charge of the second year to carry these ideas forward for another year. And by these ideas, he didn't just mean integrated teaching, but he did mean the class democracy. I thought you know, James, this was fairly radical stuff. I thought I might get fired. The last thing I thought would be I'd get promoted to be in charge of a whole year group. And the teachers had the choice, like me, of moving up with their class, and several of them did, and one or two didn't, and we made a couple of new appointments. But in the second year, the democratic approach with class meetings, etc., was more simple, was more general. On the other hand, I hadn't written it all down. I just explained what I did. What was compulsory was that every humanities class elected form representatives to the various year group clubs that started, but also to the second year committee. And the head was fantastic with the second year committee. But again, it led to problems for me. I'll give you an example. The kids weren't allowed in the school at lunchtime unless it was raining. The second year kids wanted to use the classrooms for a lot of their clubs and activities. And they went to the head and they said, please, can we use our classrooms at lunchtime and break? And if any damage gets done, we've got a year group bank account. We'll pay you. We'll recompense the school for any damage. We'll provide a kind of insurance. And he thought, he played along with this and said, okay. So you can imagine the effect that had on the rest of the school. Lunchtime, all the second years would go and use their classrooms for activities, but nobody else in the school, including the older kids, was allowed into the building. And things, looking back on it, I think I could have done things in a far more politically sensitive way. But on the other hand, you know, it was my second year of teaching, James, and as I was making it up as I went along.
Yeah. And so it expanded, and the court was the reason that you gained that press attention that you mentioned. Was it the Sun who visited, and they wanted to observe one of these court sessions?
Well, they didn't admit that's what they wanted. One of the parents of a kid in my class, who was an incredible supporter of what was going on, told her cousin, who was a reporter on the Sun, what was going on in her kid's school and how much her son enjoyed going to school and loved taking part in the class democracy. And he asked her if she could ask me if he could visit the class with a photographer. This is, the naivety is unbelievable. It didn't occur to me to tell the head because we often had outside speakers coming in to talk to the kids. And I thought, well, it's just another outside speaker. I wasn't entirely clear that he intended to write a report in the paper. Anyway, he came and the kids thought it was wonderful. We got a real life reporter and a real life photographer. And we can talk about our newspaper. And they did. We had a special class meeting for the reporter, and the kids asked lots of questions about what's it like to be on a real newspaper. Do you ever have your articles pulled? Do you ever have arguments with other journalists? And they were quite... But at the end of the class meeting, we needed to have a meeting of the class court because one particular boy, normally very well behaved, Ian, had broken every class rule for about a week. And I and the others hadn't worked out what was going on. And then it suddenly dawned on me, what Ian has done, he's guaranteed that he's going to be in court when the press are here. So he thinks he's going to get his picture in the paper.
And he was right.
And he was right. When the court came into session, I noticed the photographer started banging away with his camera, and the reporter became much more interested in what was going on. And I realized that they'd come looking possibly for a negative story about kangaroo courts or something.
And obviously it was a bit of a dangerous game because the Sun, you know, it can go either way, can't it? This could be like loony lefty teacher taking liberties with kids' education. You know, you could easily see that it could have gone that way.
What happened was the reporter phoned me up and said, look, Larry Lamb, the editor, thinks this is a fantastic story. And he's very happy for the Sun to pay for a bus, a coach. We'll come and pick all the kids up at about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the evening, and we'll take them all to London, and they can have the first 35 copies that come off the press with their story in it, and we'll give them some lemonade and cakes, and someone, the editor of The Stone, who actually is the sort of last sub-editor before the paper finally goes to bed, he was the father of someone I'd known years before, and he agreed to show them around the presses, and so we all trooped up to London, all 34 kids in a bus, and were given tea and cakes. The editor signed the first 35 copies and gave them to the kids. It was unbelievable. And then
you literally saw them coming off the presses.
Yes.
Someone's got to film this story, Derry.
The linotype operator grabs them. He grabbed them as they came past. And what they do is they grab one to check that it's printing properly. And he grabbed copy after copy after copy and gave them to the kids. It was absolutely lovely. I had a bit of a problem with that one because some of the other teachers said, well, why did you take your class, Derry? It was the second year by then. Why didn't you take some kids from every second year class? That was another difficult judgment one that perhaps I got it wrong. But the lovely thing is the story is in the book, what they printed. And it was such a lovely report.
Yeah.
It absolutely paid complete respect to the kids. It described the meeting, but then it did have a photograph of Ian standing up in court and the three magistrates calling. And then one they loved to put in was me sitting at the back as a member of the jury with my hand up, asking for permission from the magistrates to speak. And that obviously tickled them. But the report was very, very supportive. It said, this is an education in democratic citizenship, and we entirely support Mr. Hannam in what he's doing. I've still got my copy. And some of the kids, now in their 60s, apparently have still got their copies. So that was a big success, yeah.
And then the story was sort of recycled with more of a right-wing slant, wasn't it, in the Mail and then the Telegraph?
Oh, God. The Telegraph got hold of it. And what the papers do is they pick up their stories from each other and find a new angle. And it had got in the local paper, I think. I know what it was. It was the incident, the second year committee took responsibility for the building and a kid broke a window. And the second year committee had a second year court and they fined the kid £4 for repairing the window.
We talked about that last week.
Yeah, and the local paper got hold of it, and then the Telegraph got hold of it. And the headline was Kangaroo Court in Aylesbury School. It was completely disgraceful. And I think the kids in the class, they wrote to the Telegraph and said, this just wasn't true. Everything you said wasn't true. And if you want to know what really happened, read The Sun. Of course, they never got a reply, James. And I doubt if any of them have ever bought the Daily Telegraph ever since.
Indeed, never buy the Telegraph. Right. So thank you for that. That's just. There's so much more that I would like to speak with you about that, but I really urge people to listen. So I beg your pardon, to read the book. And as I say, throughout this conversation, I just keep seeing this being filmed. This should be a film. This should be a film. So before we move on to your later career, and then to bring all of this back to the current moment and what this tells us about the current moment that we're living in, and how these ideas might help to shape the future of education potentially, and indeed they already are doing, aren't they? This is not just you. We should mention that democratic education is a very rich and broad tradition, far more happening internationally than there is in this country. But it would be interesting to bring this back to your wider work in the world of democratic education. But first, I'm interested, and I imagine that listeners will be as well, in the politics of this. You've already touched upon it a few times. You've alluded to a few sort of cases where other teachers in the staff room were making comments, or they weren't happy particularly about what was happening. You talked about that, the maths teacher who, when the kids were using that hands up system in their classroom, they weren't happy with that because they felt that it was undermining their authority by like wanting to make the kids work in a particular way. I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit more, because it did seem to become, in that second part of this story in the book, it seems to become a bit more complicated with, these sort of rivalries, and I don't know how you would frame it. I don't want to put words into your mouth. I wonder if you could just speak to that a little bit.
Yes. Well, you've got to remember, this was my first job as a teacher. It wasn't my first work job, but I'd worked in the past very much on my own. When I worked for Oxfam, I was working on my own very largely. Not in the psychiatric hospital, but there I was very much in a learning capacity. In this first job in the secondary modern school, I sort of was hiding myself away in my own class to see what would work. And it all worked embarrassingly well in some respects. But what I wasn't sufficiently, I don't know if it's a lack of empathy or what, or just I'm too driven by what I want to do. I didn't take enough care over the rest of the team for a start, and that gradually dawned on me. Unfortunately, the team leader, when we were the 7 teachers in the first year, was a really lovely guy, a much lovelier guy than me, I would say, and tolerated me, and then saw there was some merit in some of the things I was doing and began to move the ideas into the whole year group. The problem came from some of the traditional heads of departments, and it was started off by the mere existence of integrated humanities, because they lost chunks of their territory and chunks of their staffing because their departments were getting smaller. As humanities started in 1 year, then moved into 2 years, and at the same time, another very interesting bunch of teachers, all have went on to interesting headships, were running a 4th and 5th year, a year 10 and year 11 integrated humanities course, social studies course. So some of the heads of traditional departments were really losing their power, if you like, in the school. So I had that on the one hand, and then if you add the democratic practice, which they saw as a threat to their discipline, etc. I mean, in my experience, it never is. It's if you just let kids, if you take what A.S. Neil says, we believe in freedom, not license. This is not about laissez-faire. This is not about kids running riot and doing whatever they want to. There are certainly structures and there are certainly controls, but the thing is they're coming from the kids and they're negotiated with the staff. So you're working together to produce an orderly classroom. You're not having a battle to achieve it. And I don't know why this just seems so totally obvious to me. Why would you not involve the kids in the decision making? Because we somehow deeply don't believe in kids. And yet if you listen to kids, they want order and they want security and they want safety and they want the world to be an interesting place. So we need to take much more notice of the kids. And that, as you know, is a difficult idea to get across to teachers who've been teaching in an authoritarian way for a long time. They don't get it. They think if you take the controls off, it's riot, laissez-faire, license, kids do as they like. And that's not what I'm advocating at all. I'm involving the kids and sharing the power and responsibility with the kids. And they respond. If you do that, as you know, they respond.
Absolutely. And, I've worked in a democratic learning community and it's a very ordered place. Like, as you say, like children don't like, your young people don't like to be in a chaotic environment. It sounds like class 1H and 2H were very effective at dealing with instances of bullying. Kids don't like to be bullied. They're very good at organizing their own affairs. And when you empower them in this way, and we heard last week about Joe's story, and there are a few examples in the book of like the young people coming up with systems and solutions to problems that you would just not have thought of. Like at one point, you mentioned earlier about, the raising of the hands thing, and one of the kids suggested that, well, it should just go to the person to your left, like whoever's got their hand up to your left in the circle, that's who it should go to next. That's such a simple idea, but I was doing this for years, and I never came up with that. Again, I wish that democratic thinking was more a feature of my teaching practice. And so you were there for 2 years, as you say, and then you moved to a different school, didn't you? You had an offer too good to refuse?
Well, there was a lovely guy who wrote a book called Open School, John Sharp, who'd run a very community-based school in Cumbria, Wyndham School. And he became head of Bicester School, which was just up the road from where I was working. And I mean, he offered me a job of head of humanities. I thought, blimey, I can't say no to that. And not just the job, but a brand new building. So you had a mixture of classrooms, an audio-visual room, recording studios, craft areas, a library area, and he was starting to some extent a new school. So the whole library budget was available. And I said to John, look, if I get this job, I'd like to involve the kids in deciding what books to put in the library. He said, absolutely.
Wow.
So I thought, this is too good to miss. So yeah, after 2 years, I moved to Bicester School and worked with John Sharp.
And did these democratic practices and class meetings and so on, was this a constant feature of your practice? Because you were in teaching for a long time.
Well, it was. Only 20 years, yeah.
Right.
But it was. I mean, the head of humanities was a heavy curriculum responsibility. And initially, it was to develop humanities in the first and second year. And I didn't have control of a year group, as it were, but I was able to appoint some very lovely people. And so we did run the lower school humanities as democratic communities to some extent. And the 8 classes, that were based in the humanities block, we ran, that they very much had control of how the block was managed in a democratic way. And we had courts and class meetings in exactly the same way, chairs and secretaries. So yes, it was a chance to do it all again. And because I was head of department, I had the authority, as it were. I wasn't just a cheeky upstart in his first year of teaching, causing trouble. I was someone with some status in the system. So it was possible to build something quite interesting there. Then what often happens is a lovely head teacher who supports everything you do retires, and the governors make a disastrous appointment. Anyway, I can't go into that in too much detail. I never know who's watching this, but one of the characters who'd worked with John Sharp in Cumbria, a guy called Roy Pearce, had got the headship of a community comprehensive school in Derbyshire, and he was looking for someone to revamp the humanities department and also to be head of house. And this was very attractive because Roy had 4 mixed age houses. So the tutor groups were mixed age tutor groups. And he wanted eventually to move towards mixed age teaching. So I thought, wow, this sounds interesting too. So I accepted that and went as head of house to Derbyshire. And that was 180 kids in 8 vertical tutor groups. And of course, the democracy took off there. Every kid in the house was involved in running something. And that was the target. that every kid would be involved in running something. And I can't even begin the list of activities that the kids started, but many of them involve work in the community.
Were they in vertical groups for their subject learning as well, or was this just
no, that was the next step for some things, but it was mainly at first tutor time.
Yeah.
The dream was, of course, for the whole curriculum to move from subject departments into the houses. So not only would the house be pastorally responsible for 180 kids, the curriculum would be taught or would be available in the houses. That was the dream. And Roy and I, funnily enough, are exchanging correspondence about it right now, because we're both thinking about a book on community education. And sometimes, you know, what you want for the next step, it's just a bridge too far. You aren't able to get there. But we got a lot of democracy going in the school. We opened up the school to the community. It became much more of a community centre. The town library moved into the school library. We had adults in GCSE and A-level classes. We were going a long way towards becoming a community school, and that was in the 80s with the growth of the Community Education Association and community schools up and down the country, especially in Leicestershire and Cambridgeshire. And of course, they're still going there.
Why do you think it is that democratic methods haven't taken root in the mainstream state schools or in the private schools, really, either, apart from the few sort of democratic schools? Because it seems like there were, you know, this was happening in the 60s and 70s, as you describe, and it wasn't just you, right? There were lots of other people who were tinkering around with these ideas and practices, and seemingly having very positive experiences with it. And yet we're in a position now where you used the word authoritarian earlier. It feels like we've gone really hard in that direction. There's lots of top-down management, and the kids don't have a voice. They're not really particularly asked what they want to learn about. They just are told that this is good for you, and this is what needs to happen. Why do you think it is? And this might be a really difficult question to ask, but what's your sense of it? Why do you think that these ideas haven't taken root?
We're a deeply class-based society, aren't we? And I think if you look at, we haven't got time here to go back into the history of education, but the creation of the public schools, the fact that they were once schools for poor kids of the parish and have been taken over by the elite, as it were. And in some ways, I think democracy is really regarded as a slightly dangerous word. Whereas if you go to the Nordic countries, where the school systems are far more democratic and participative, where there are national school student organisations, which are taken very seriously by government departments of education and county councils. The kids are really listened to. I mean, Norway is a classic example. There's a wonderful national school students organisation called EON, Elevorganisasjonen i Norge. And if the government is thinking of making changes to the curriculum, it discusses it at national and local level with the young people. Now, it's not hard, is it? Every school elects young people to their own school students' council, taken very seriously by law, not just by the whim of the head teacher. If a Norwegian secondary head has bullying in the school and he doesn't listen to the kids and do something about it, they can call in the ombudsman, who can demand a meeting between the students and the head teacher, and something will be done about it. It doesn't often happen, but it can happen. So the structures are created in such a way that the kids have a meaningful voice, that they have access to power, as it were. They're not just tokenistic talking shops. We've never achieved that in this country. Outside schools like Sands and Summerhill, though you could be optimistic, couldn't you, about the growing number of democratic schools in this country. I mean, I could immediately rattle off at least half a dozen. Something's going on, I think. And there are there's massive parental discontent with what we've got now, apart from the fact that student discontent, which seems to be taking a more militant form. I read Tom Bennett saying that these kids have got to be put down and these demonstrations that spread on TikTok have got to be put a stop to. And I thought, oh, yes, that's what I'd expect of you. No willingness to say perhaps we should listen a bit more carefully to the kids. But I noticed he did say at the end of his statement, pretty negative authoritarian statement at the end of it, he did say there are pathways that the kids should take that are reasonable and negotiated, and they will be listened to. Well, Tom, I wish there were, and I'm very pleased that you think there should be such pathways for young people to express their views, because that, of course, is the answer to rioting. If we listen to the kids, the ones who support the minority who want to go out and cause trouble would not be listened to. I'll give you an example. There was a school strike at the school that I had 1H, 2H. The older students organised a school strike. Kids from different year groups went out on strike for a day. Instead of going out on strike, the second year had an emergency committee meeting to decide what their attitude would be to the strike. They were the only year group that had a structure, that had an organisation, and they voted to not join the strike because they said everything they'd requested of the head teacher, he'd discussed it with them and negotiated with them. So why would they want to cause him trouble by going on strike? And the only group that didn't go out and stand in the playground were the second years, who all went to their lessons. And one very militant teacher said to me, I forgot to put that in the book, by the way. One militant teacher said to me, oh, Derry, you see, you're just undermining the will to resist of these kids. And I said, if you'll excuse me using the word, but that's complete bollocks, because what these kids have learned is that you can democratically negotiate to move towards what you want. And that, that story should have gone in the book, shouldn't it?
Yeah. You'll have to do a revised edition. It can go.
That's where I got a kicking from the hard left, if you like, for undermining the will to resist of the kids.
Because you made them so damn reasonable.
Well, and they learned that by negotiating and being reasonable, you could bring about change without upsetting any. Well, I upset a few people, I suppose, but they didn't. But there you go. That's the truth of it. The second years were organised. This is really a message for Tom Bennett. The second year were organised and they weren't interested in riots. They were interested in negotiating better conditions for the students.
Fascinating. And as you say, you know, like internationally, there's lots happening on the democratic education front. One thing that I'd like to ask you is that this book was written like a couple of years ago, wasn't it? It came out, and the story of what happened with class 1H and 2H happened from 69 to 71, I believe.
Yes.
So the obvious question is, why did it take so long to write about it? Why, or perhaps a better way to phrase that is, why now?
Well, I get invited to give talks at conferences, and I usually mention my own experience of working in a democratic way with young people and what fun it was and how much we achieved. And I'm afraid it sounds a bit big-headed, but several people have said to me, look, you must write this up. And I said, well, I've got boxes full of contemporaneous notes. The police would be very happy about my evidence base. So perhaps I will, but I was too busy doing it to write about it. And I thought, well, I better start somewhere. And looking back, it was partly the kids getting in touch with me. That some 60-year-old kids who'd been in the class got in touch with me on Facebook and said that you're still at it, you know. And then Alfie Cohn in the States and Mike Fielding at the Institute in London that he was, they said you should write it up. So I have.
Right. There you go. I'm very glad that you did. And also to bring it back to this moment of why now, the book ends by you sort of asking, to what extent would it be possible to draw lessons from your experience, but also from democratic education more widely into the English state school sector? And it is the strapline of the book is becoming a democratic teacher in a state school. And I
Yes,
think that that's important.
so do I.
Why do you think that? And perhaps it's a bit of a too obvious a question to ask, but we are where we are. Why do you think that the English state school system or the school system in any country should be going down this democratic, participative, experiential route?
I should confess that when I took early retirement from teaching, I'd been an acting head for a while, and it all got, it was beginning to get to my blood pressure a bit. And I accepted an invitation to join, to become an Ofsted inspector. Probably a big mistake, but I've worked in the same school for some years, and I thought this would be an interesting opportunity to visit other schools. I had no idea what a pernicious and punitive and dreadful teacher bashing organisation it would become. And I began to visit other schools, and I found schools, for example, a school in Oxfordshire that had an electives programme. And this was so interesting, where the kids were creating the activities for half a day a week only. It was a rural school where lots of kids had to go home by bus and they couldn't take part in extracurricular activities. So what the head did was bring the extracurricular activities into the curriculum, as it were. And the kids had created a vast range of activities, including building a racing car. Silverstone was just up the road. And at the same time, the DFEE and Cambridge University gave me some money to go around the world, basically, and look at alternative forms of assessment in particular. And I was able to use this to go and visit. I visited Summerhill for the first time, Sudbury Valley School in Massachusetts, Hadera School in Israel. I visited lots of democratic schools, some in France, some in Germany, some in the Netherlands, some in Denmark, etc., etc. And what I found was something not too dissimilar to 1H, that all the decisions in these schools were made at the school meeting or school parliament on the basis of one person, one vote. The kids were absolutely involved in making the rules, but not just making the rules, as is quite commonly the case, but actually enforcing them, in making them work. That was typical of these schools. And what I found was almost no bullying, and that the kids could be given a great deal of responsibility, more than I was ever able to do in the state system. Though I have to say, Hadera School in Israel is now fully state funded, as are the other 35 democratic schools in Israel. It's rather sad with what's going on with Netanyahu now and with Palestine, because within the Israeli education system, it's the best developed example in the world, I think, of fully funding of democratic schools within the state system. But anyway, I went to Sudbury Valley School. I'm sure you know about it.
Yeah, I had Peter Gray on the podcast a few months ago, and we talked about it at some length. Sudbury Valley in Massachusetts.
Yeah, I know Peter very well. But I went to Sudbury Valley, and Mimsy Sadowski, one of the founders, was going to show me around, and she was very busy with the parent. And I was given a 10-year-old who was going to show me round. And he said to me, "Oh, Derry, which part of the school would you like to see?" So I said, "Well, I'm at one of my jobs is I'm a music inspector in England. Can I see the music room?" "Oh, sure," he said. So we went to the music room. All the instruments in perfect working order, a beautiful grand piano, perfectly in tune. And I sat down at this grand piano and started playing a Duke Ellington tune, Satin Doll. This kid said to me, "Oh, Derry," he said, I'm so sorry, but if you do that, I'll have to bring you up at school meeting. So I said, oh, my God, what have I done wrong? He said, well, you're not allowed to play the instruments unless you've been certified as safe to handle the musical instruments. And if you do touch the musical instruments and you're not certified, you'll get brought up at the Judicial Committee, the JC. So I said, oh dear, I'm terribly sorry. I've only been in the building 10 minutes and I've broken the law. How do I get certified? And he said, well, you have to play some music to a member of the Music Corporation who can then certify you. So I said, well, who's the Music Corporation? He said, well, it's all the kids and staffers who know how to look after musical instruments. So I said, okay, can you tell me how I find someone on the Music Corporation? Because I'd love to play the piano. And he said, well, I'm on the Music Corporation. I play the viola. So I said, what do I have to do to get certified? He said, play me something you love. So I played the same tune I'd been playing a few minutes before. And he said, okay, you're certified. And he wrote my name down on the list of certified musical instrument players at Sudbury Valley School. And I'm told I'm still on that list years later. But it's an interesting example of power and responsibility being shared between those who are capable of accepting it, not just by what age they are or what status they have. And the whole school was run by these corporations who looked after. And of course, the amazing thing about Sudbury Valley is there's no curriculum as such beyond what the kids ask for. But I was very interested also in Hadera school. That was interesting in Israel, because there was a kind of compromise. Summerhill has a curriculum, as you know, but the kids don't have to go to lessons if they don't want to. That's what upset Ofsted. But at Hadera, there is a curriculum. There are also self-generated curriculum, like at Sudbury Valley, and there are also rooms that are always staffed by a teacher of a particular discipline. So if you got stuck with a maths problem in your self-directed project, you can go to a maths teacher and get help straight away. And so there was this balance of pathways, given curriculum, available teaching expertise, complete self-direction. And the kids found their own pathway through this. And the results were amazing. The kids getting to university, they were just the same as any other school. So the anxiety that these methods can't be trusted to produce the academic results, the evidence is against them. I mean, Sudbury Valley keeps a massive record of alumni, and there's a growing body of evidence that these methods work. My doubt is whether they work for all kids or whether there's an element of self-selection going on in who goes to the school. I've no doubt that Sudbury Valley is extremely successful for the Sudbury Valley kids. And I'm, funnily enough, involved in a debate right now about people of different ethnic communities in the United States. Some ethnic groups, it is believed, are very suspicious of democratic education because they feel they're already so disadvantaged that their kids can't take the risk of leaving school unable to read, and they don't quite believe in it. It's a very interesting debate. And Lucy Stevens' experience in Croydon now, where she's able to offer free spaces to people from all communities, is a very interesting piece of counter evidence, because I think Lucy is attracting people from every ethnic background in Croydon. Anyway, that's another subject. Can I tell you a Hadera story?
Please do.
Yakov Heck, the head who'd invited me, said, I said to him, there's a school parliament and everyone can go. I said, do the little kids go? And he said, well, on the whole, no, they don't. And basically, the school is run by the older kids and a few extraordinarily able or extraordinarily egotistic little kids. So when I arrived at the school, I saw this little procession of 7-8-year-olds walking across the campus. And I said, can you tell me where the parliament is? I'm supposed to meet Mr. Heck there. And And they said, oh, sure, because they all spoke with American accents as well as Hebrew ones. But yes, we're going to the Parliament now. So I thought, that's interesting. I said, Mr. Hector told me that on the whole, people your age didn't go to the Parliament. Oh, that's true, they said. But today we're all going because there's an item on the agenda which says that the older kids want to take one of our Lego rooms and turn it into a second computer room for older kids. And they said, we're not having it. So I went to the Parliament and we sat down, and we got there a bit early because all these little kids wanted to make sure they were in the best seats. And then the older kids who were running the Parliament came in and saw all these little kids, and quite a shock. What are you all doing here? And they said, we've come to vote. Anyway,
Wow.
the item came up on the agenda, transferring use of Lego room to computer room. 200 against, 22 in favour. I'm exaggerating probably. But the point was there that the little kids knew the structure was available to them to have a voice that really mattered in decisions that were being made in the school. Just another one. I've got lots of these stories from democratic schools.
I love it. Amazing. Right. So I've got 3 questions, Derry, that I ask to all of my guests. And they are, what are the positives? What do you think that we're getting right at the moment? And this could be, you might want to talk about democratic education. You might want to talk about other stuff in the state system or in the independent sector, wherever. It could be just at a teacher level. It could be at a policy level. It could be something international. So however you want to take that, what do you think is a really positive thing that is happening currently? The second question is, what do you think the major challenges that we face at the moment? And that could be educational, or it could be like global, and education could potentially play a part in that. And then the third question is, how might we fix that challenge? How might we overcome that challenge? So,
Wow.
So I know 3 biggies to spring on you at the end. So positive stuff first. What springs to mind?
Well, I think it is positive. But when I first went to an IDEC, International Democratic Education Committee, community meeting, probably 20 years ago, there were nothing like as many democratic schools around the world as there are now. And we've got these continental education communities have sprung up. UDEC, the European Democratic Education Committee, ATDEC, the Asian and Pacific one, the Australian one, the INDEC is the Indian Democratic Education.
Wow.
These are growing around the world with their own conferences, etc., and their own sharing of knowledge and information. That's very encouraging. There's a growth in the number of democratic schools in the UK. There is the emergence of some serious alternative thinking about curriculum and assessment going on, as you know, in places like the XP schools and School 21 and what's it called, Surrey Square Primary School. I was listening to them talk about their digital profiling program, which just sounds so exciting as an alternative to CVs and GCSEs. So there are some exciting things going on. But, I'm arguing for a couple of specific ones. Apart from a more relevant curriculum with more choice, more productive assessment that doesn't fail 30% of the kids. And we do have some models. Also that student voice should be taken seriously in this country. At class, school, local authority, multi-academy trust, or national level, student voice should really be built in with the kids given time to do it properly, right down to the class level so all kids can be involved. That needs to be done for everybody and could be done tomorrow. But my big argument at present is, as you know, the 20% campaign. I would like to see, it's unrealistic to expect the whole curriculum in the state system to become self-directed learning overnight. I think that's unrealistic. The fact that some schools can have 100% self-directed learning, like the democratic schools I mentioned, means we've got some models. I call them pioneers of possibility. They show what can be done, certainly for the kinds of kids who are at them, if not for everybody. I'm not sure about that. But the 20% could be done more or less immediately for all schools, all kids, that 20% of curriculum time should be wrenched from the overprescribed curriculum that we've got to create a space that belongs to the kids for them to follow their interests, concerns, passions, questions, however you want to phrase it. It should be very much in the hands of the kids, negotiated with the staff, of course, because you're not going to change the staff of a school. But it would be interesting if you did this. You would have to create a democratic structure in the school to negotiate the switch. And then teachers would need to decide, do I want to work in this 20% as a facilitator for the younger people's learning, or do I want to stay as a didactic, not necessarily authoritarian, but a didactic subject teacher? So you would let the teachers choose, but the kids would then have this space in the curriculum. It could be 1 day a week. It could be 5 lessons like you did it in your school. With teacher volunteers, if the kids chose to carry on with their regular curriculum in this time, I suppose there'd be no reason to stop them. I've got a phone. I'd stopped. Okay. And this is beginning to happen around the world. You've got the electives program I mentioned in some UK school. In my school, we had activities programs. You've got the 20-time program in the United States, which is catching on. The 20-time project. Whoops.
Oh, right.
Can you see it?
Yeah. How educators can launch Google's formula for future-ready innovation. What's that about?
Well, that is about giving the kids 20% of the curriculum time to follow their own interests. And it's called Google's formula because if you work at a certain level in Google or 3M, you do get paid work time to pursue your own interests in the belief if you encourage people to do that, it will eventually benefit the company. And Esther Wojcicki, who runs the 20% program at Palo Alto High School in Silicon Valley, her daughter went to Google and used her 20% time to create Gmail, which has been one of the biggest earners that the company's got. So it pays off. There's an English chemical company called Scott Barder, which uses its company training time to encourage the staff to learn new stuff about anything they like. I met someone who worked in chemical analysis, a chemist at Scott Barder, who used his company training time to grow roses. And you could say, well, what's the connection? The connection is learning. So if you can switch on learning, it benefits everybody. So the point of my 20% is, interestingly, the Economist Intelligence Unit produced a report last year called Staff of 2030. And in it, they argue from the Economist Intelligence Unit, for heaven's sake, what could be more mainstream? They argue, well, Sol Khan was on the committee, but so that perhaps explains some of it, but they argued that kids should have 20% of time in their own hands. You've got, in Germany, you've got the Schule im Aufbruch movement, which has now spread to 300 schools. Margaret Rasfeld, she calls it Friday, free day, that 1 day a week, 20%, the kids should have to develop any project they like within the overall framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, which, like David said, is, what doesn't fit into the Sustainable Development Goals? Almost nothing. So that's 20% time effectively happening in Germany. You've got in the International Baccalaureate, the personal project, Rosina Dorelli's lovely Da Vinci learning skills program that she's developing on. One of 5 of the prongs of the curriculum is the personal project. So
Right.
the idea of 20% seems to be catching on. You could say that the point of learning to be self-directed is to have experience of a deeper understanding of what it is that you want to do and want to become. I think Ian Cunningham's very good at this. If we don't do this, and we've got artificial intelligence wiping out swathes of employment, if we haven't got people who can find interest and passion in their own lives outside their paid employment, then we're going to have a big problem. I mean, for example, there are something like 2 million truck drivers in the United States. It won't be long before they're all out of work because the trucks will be self-managed. They've nearly all got guns. What are they going to do with themselves? It's a bit scary. So I think we've got to create education systems that create people who know what they want to do with their lives, who discover their own passions and purposes. And I see that the 20% as a start, if you like. When Yakov and Hecht and I presented this 20% idea to a big conference in Strasbourg, a Council of Europe conference a couple of years ago, Yakov put into, a bit naughtily, he put into his keynote speech the 20% idea and asked people to vote on whether they thought it was a good idea or not. There were over 1,000 administrators, teachers, all kinds of people there interested in democracy and education. They nearly all voted for it. And some who didn't, I collared them afterwards and said, well, what didn't you like about that 20% idea? They said, it's not enough. It should be more than 20%.
Well,
and of course,
that's interesting, because I would come in there, like I totally agreed with the 20% rule, and like I said earlier, you know, that's what we had in the learning skills curriculum, and we now work with schools mainly internationally because there's not a lot happening in England at the moment on the self-directed learning front in the state sector. We worked with one school very intensively last year, Knysna High School in South Africa, and they have done an amazing job of implementing a learning skills curriculum with one lesson a day, 20% of time given over to this. And it's very moving. If you, on our website, there are some video testimonials of the teachers talking about what this has meant to these kids who've been given a voice and a platform and a space where they can say stuff about their own lives, and for that to, you know, for that to feature as part of the curriculum so that they can take up space and feel listened and seen for the first time. It's amazing. I would go further. I would argue for a further 20% of interdisciplinary learning. You know, I think that you can make a strong case for subject disciplines, but that's not the only game in town. Like, you can't understand. I often talk about this, is like, you know, on the news, they don't say in history news, this has happened, and in geography news, this has happened. It's like news stories are a combination of history and geography and politics. Like this refugee story that's playing out at the moment, that's really complicated story that involves an understanding of the law, an understanding of different countries and the humanitarian crises that are playing out, an understanding of the way that migration plays out across the field, the history of the law in this area. There's so many layers to understand, and also like all of the human stories that, you know, this whole sort of crisis, if you want to call it a crisis, is made of. It's so rich and so complicated. You can't possibly hope to understand the concept of the question of immigration by just studying subject disciplines, and then somehow your understanding of the world will emerge from that. And kids need to practice that stuff. They need to practice interdisciplinarity, just as they need to practice, as you said, made the case very powerfully just then, that if people are going to be able to survive in a increasingly volatile, very, very rapidly changing world, where, as you say, AI is going to, and already is, transforming our lives in many different ways, also living in a climate changed world, which, you know, many people are already doing, you need to be flexible, you need to be agile, you need to be quick on your feet and be able to adapt to new situations, to learn new skills. And if you haven't practiced that, then you're not going to be as good at it as people who have practiced it. And so it seems like there's a very strong case for what you're saying to me. And also just to bring it back to self-directed learning theory, you know, we've sort of known about this stuff. Was it the 70s or 80s when Deci and Ryan were doing their work around this? We know what it takes to make somebody who's an autonomous, effective, independent, well-regulated learner and essentially a functioning human being. And that's autonomy, relatedness, and competence. And it seems like the first of those is just completely absent in terms of student autonomy and teacher autonomy within the mainstream sector at the moment. The workplace, beyond the world of education, workplaces, as you say, with places like Google and elsewhere, workplaces are really starting to understand the importance of autonomy in the workplace. Relatedness as well, like building in the opportunities for people to connect with one another. And what you're talking about, there's a reason that the word community is featured so strongly in your work. You know, this is a community-based approach. It's about learning to live, as you say, in a world that's in a world that's made of people. The struggle of interdependence, as you put it. And then competence. And it feels like the mainstream system at the moment has just put all of their eggs into the competence basket. It's just like, we just need to try to do this, to use this time in the most efficient way possible, to just try to make these kids as competent as we possibly can within the constraints of the curriculum and within the constraints of subject disciplines and within the constraints of our assessment.
Okay, James. Well, ask the CBI whether the competence that they would like to see in young employees, ask them if they think the school system is successfully producing the competence that they'd like to see. I mean, the employers themselves aren't happy with what's going on. Is it possible to mention one other alternative, the 20% idea?
Please do.
Lawrence Kohlberg, sort of rather controversial psychologist in some way, certainly quite rightly so amongst what you might call feminist psychology. But Kohlberg believed that people learn best in what he called just communities. So, and he created schools within schools in several high schools in Massachusetts, Scarsdale, for example, or one of the Boston high schools. He created schools within schools where kids and parents could choose to spend their whole time in the alternative school within a school that was based in the buildings of the mainstream school. And these SWSs, as he called them, were very, very democratic. And this idea is beginning to recur now. A friend of mine in Tallinn, in Estonia, Charlie Ramira, is head of a school within a school in a big high school in Tallinn, which is working very, very participatively and democratically. And parents and students can choose to spend their whole day in the school within a school, their whole time in the school within a school, or to go back to the mainstream school. And there's a certain amount of movement in both directions. Some kids get a bit alienated in the mainstream, conventionally authoritarian school, and they choose to come to the school within a school, which interestingly in Estonia is called Subamai. And Subamai is Estonian for Summerhill. And that's not a coincidence. But there's another possibility. For those who want more than 20% self-directed learning time, you could have a school within a school. And of course, you could have both at the same time. You could have 20% available for all kids in a 20% block or 20% department, within which some kids could gradually extend the amount of time that they wanted to spend in the self-directed learning. It could be completely flexible. And some kids, for example, after a period of time, might find that they can handle 40% or 60%. But I don't want to argue for more than 20%, because I want it to be a reasonable request. If we want kids to develop the autonomy, agency, collaborative communication, curiosity, all these things we want to see developed, and it's not happening, in the mainstream 100% curriculum, it's not unreasonable, is it, to look for these very desirable qualities to be developed within a portion of school curriculum time. And 20% seems about right because it's already happening around the world in different places.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you know, I'm 100%, I'm 120% on board with this idea. And so thank you for that. And I like the way in which you answered all three of those questions around positives, challenges, and solutions. You answered all three of those in one, which is very impressive, especially at such short notice. So thank you for that. I really enjoyed this conversation, Derry. There's much more that we could talk about, I'm sure. Thank you for your time. Thank you for writing this tremendous book. And I know I've said it a couple of times, but I really think that the very slim chance that any Hollywood screenwriters are listening to this would make such a brilliant screenplay for a film. Like, you can picture it, the visit to the sun, the beef with the other teachers, like, it's got everything. Like, it's absolutely, and the newspaper, being like spreading across the room. There's so much richness in what you've written, and
we didn't even mention the kids doing the teacher training. There's a chapter in the book about the kids training teachers in democratic methodologies. Anyway, never mind. Thanks, James.
That's right. So as a final call, then, like, is there anything? Yeah. So first of all, I recommend to everybody to read this book. Like, it is tremendous, and I love that bit about the kids training the teachers. Beautiful. Is there anything by way of a final message that you would like to relay to our listeners? Is there anything that you would suggest that they look at or get involved in or find out more about?
Just interesting, you mentioned agile learning. There's a Zoom discussion this afternoon at 5:00, organised by Agile Europe. It's an Erasmus-funded programme to develop agile learning across European school systems. That just cropped up. I'm busy talking to the University of Arizona about their experiment. They've introduced participatory budgeting to a number of Arizona high schools, and they're finding it to be very effective in developing the agency and autonomy, all the things we've been talking about, plus financial literacy, which is pretty important, by involving the young people in how the school budgets are spent. And it's being managed from Arizona University Participatory Budgeting Program, which other people might be interested in. I think there's a lot of parallels with all the things we've been talking about there. And of course, we need state funding. The state needs to be brave enough to fund alternatives in this country so that we can see what works. But to write off alternatives as being crazy or not working, there's as little evidence for that as, unfortunately, we have evidence for how effective they are at present. We do need a lot more research and a lot more evidence. But before that can happen, we've got to create the places to study.
Indeed. There's a lot to do. There's a lot to do.
Thanks, James. Been great.
All right. Thank you, Derry. Take care.